1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the big three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we'll see a major upset for the Western Allies in January. How the Red Army launched the biggest military offensive in history. And how in February, British bombers took off to pulverize German cities in a series of controversial military decisions full of behind-the-scenes scheming. The previous year had seen many successful Allied advances. To the east of Germany, the Red Army rapidly recovered virtually all of the land they had lost to the Nazis. On the Western Front, the Allies had landed on the Normandy beaches on D-Day and then made fast progress through northern Europe, right up to the borders of Germany. Paris had been liberated on the 25th of August 1944. A week later, British soldiers entered Brussels to a warm welcome, and by the start of 1945, Britain expected their leader, Churchill, to take them to a speedy victory in Europe.
Of course, to people following the news in the papers, the breakout from Normandy, the advance towards the Rhine, the liberation of Paris, all these things did happen after a certain point so quickly that it looked as if everything would be rolled out by the end of 1944. But those in charge, Churchill and his commanders-in-chief and his war cabinet, knew that, in fact, the Germans intended to fight every inch of the way.
The Allies destroy the German armies in the west, and then there's this extraordinary period of rapid advance right up almost to the Rhine and the border of Germany, and everyone thinks the war will be over by Christmas. Well, of course it isn't.
Far from giving up, in total secrecy, Hitler planned a counterattack. This took the Allies completely by surprise. In the depths of one of the worst winters on record, Hitler amassed 200,000 men on the Belgian border, hidden in the thickly forested Ardennes area. On the 16th of December 1944, they launched their attack on 83,000 unsuspecting American troops. What became known as the Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last desperate attempt to avert defeat.
If anyone has said the Germans are going to assemble 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks for a surprise offensive in the West, people said they're mad. And yet that's exactly what Hitler does. In the winter snow, with cloud cover, so there's no air activity by the Allied side, he bursts something like 25 divisions on, I think, 5 unsuspecting American divisions and almost breaks through. And his aim is to try and get up to the ports, up towards Antwerp, and split the British and Americans.
The Germans took 25,000 prisoners. American troops heard that the Nazis were shooting and torturing captives. One of the Allied soldiers was Curtis Whiteway.
I carefully crawled up to the scouts as they pointed ahead in the trees. One of our guys was hanging in the trees, spread eagle standing upright. He was twitching and his arms and legs were tied to nearby trees. He was totally nude and the Germans had taken some kind of torch. They burned his eyes out. He was still alive. One of the men behind me cried out, "Put him out of his misery." I realized that this was a warning to us. Don't come any further into Germany, or this will happen to you.
The Germans succeeded in driving a bulge straight through the Allies' front line. A counter-offensive was launched. General Eisenhower, in command of the European operations, put the American General Bradley and Britain's Montgomery in charge of beating back the Germans.
Eisenhower stands back and he says to Montgomery, you handle all the armies, including the American armies, to the north, And he said to Bradley in the south, you handle all the American armies in the south, and Eisenhower's coolness and ability to delegate down to these two heavyweights, and these two are heavyweights, actually is what crushes the German offensive, that and lack of fuel.
Casualties were high on both sides. Nearly 100,000 Germans and 80,000 Americans were killed, missing or injured. This was the most costly battle the Americans had fought in northwestern Europe. By mid-January 1945, the Germans had been forced to withdraw from the Ardennes completely. The consequences of this battle stalled the Allies' advance into Germany and delayed the end of the war in Europe.
Part of the shock of the Ardennes offensive is not just the psychological shock of being attacked by an enemy you think is defeated, but it's also the heavy casualties, and the logistic build-up for the push into Germany for 1945 is completely disrupted.
American confidence had been severely bruised by that experience. After January 1945, they were determined to move very cautiously. The Bulge offensive had slowed up the Western Allies while making it easier for the Russians to drive much faster and harder into Germany.
By mid-January, Northern Europe was in ruins. The Western Allies put their plans to invade Germany on hold. But in the Soviet Union, tanks poured off the production lines so that Stalin could launch a major new offensive on the Eastern Front.
The Russians were poised to launch their huge offensive, and vast armies had been massed. So the Russians had had 4 or 5 months of building up their forces because they had big difficulties. There wasn't anything like the road network or rail network that there was in the West. And every inch of the way they had to build railways and restore roads to move supplies forward to enable their millions of men to launch the offensive. So the Germans knew that they were approaching the last act.
For 2 long years, the Red Army had fought the Germans in the Soviet Union. As they began to reclaim their homeland, the true horror of the Nazi occupation slowly dawned on them. In Kiev, they found that hundreds of civilians had been killed by the fleeing Germans.
As Soviet troops moved very fast, they came across even worse scenes of bestial behavior, and this convinced Soviet troops, if they weren't already convinced, that they were facing an enemy that had behaved in an utterly inhuman fashion. They didn't regard the Germans as fellow members of the human race, and they themselves carried out a campaign of pillage and rape that was pretty disgraceful.
Many Soviet soldiers have been encouraged to keep revenge diaries through the past few years by their political officers, in which they wrote down the terrible things they'd seen the Germans do in Russia so that they could extract revenge and enter it in their revenge ledger.
On the 12th of January, in freezing cold weather, the Red Army started a massive new offensive towards Germany through Poland. It began on the Ukrainian front. Two days later, General Zhukov led the main push from the Belarusian front. The Soviet Union succeeded in mobilizing a massive force of over 6 million men, an amazing feat. By the 19th of January, they had taken the Polish capital, Warsaw. Fleeing Germans had destroyed much of the city. 3/4 of the buildings were in ruins. Then, on the 27th of January, the Red Army entered Auschwitz. The real horror of what they'd found did not become widely known until the war in Europe was over. Meanwhile, the Red Army continued its relentless advance on Germany.
One of the paradoxes about the Red Army was that it was an extraordinary mixture of the most savage discipline and the most ferocious indiscipline. That I remember meeting a Soviet tank officer called Kudryashov, who told me a story about his driver, who was a completely illiterate Tartar, who one night he'd been left on watch and fell asleep. And Kudryashov woke him up and said, "It's a firing squad for you." And he didn't mean it, but his driver knew very well that if Kudryashov reported him, it probably would be the firing squad, and the man fell helpless on his knees. And the next day, the driver came to Kudryashov, and he said, would he write a letter home for him? Because he couldn't write himself. And Kudryashov said, yes. He said, I'll write a letter home saying how you fell asleep on watch last night. And again, the driver fell on his knees in terror, because he said, say anything you like, say anything, but don't do it.
The poor driver was killed in action 2 days later. At tremendous cost, the Soviet Union now occupied large parts of Eastern Europe, but Churchill was worried by this turn of events.
Churchill hoped to bring Stalin to a conference before the Red Army was in any one of the Eastern European capitals, so that they could discuss the future of Eastern Europe with no force majeure of Soviet tanks being in every capital. And he pleaded with Stalin and Roosevelt, let's have our conference now. And Stalin, cannily and understandably from his perspective, said no. Churchill even, the conference was going to be held in Jerusalem. And Stalin said, I can't fly. My doctors say I can't fly. So Churchill sent him the railway timetable. In those days, you could take a train.
But Stalin was an intensely suspicious man, and he thought that at any time Roosevelt or Churchill might play a trick on him, might gang up on him, just as he would do to them if he possibly could. He loved to play Roosevelt off against Churchill and vice versa.
Churchill felt very much that the borders of post-war Europe would be determined where the armies met. His fear was that communism, which was advancing with the Red Army steadily, would essentially advance to the Atlantic.
By the end of January, the Allies had Germany surrounded, but still Hitler wouldn't give up. The Nazis wanted to fight to the bitter end, and the war in Europe was far from over. By the end of January 1945, the Americans were making headway in the Pacific against the Japanese. They had won a major sea battle capturing the strategically important island of Leyte in the Philippines. But the outcome of the Pacific War was still far from certain. In Europe, by the end of January, the Western Allies were moving towards northern Germany, waiting for the big push. Worried about the size of potential casualties, the Americans wanted reinforcements to be fully prepared for the onslaught. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had made astonishing advances and had reached the River Oder just 45 miles from Berlin. But Stalin was also forced to pause. They faced ferocious German resistance, and their supply line was stretched to the limit. They had no choice but to wait for more troops.
Stalin's army was a fighting force such as the world had never before seen. It was an extraordinary blend of the sophisticated and the technological with the barbaric. In front went punishment battalions. They were units composed of people who'd committed either political or disciplinary offences and who were simply thrown ruthlessly at the enemy as cannon fodder, either to clear minefields or just to test the enemy's fire. And then you've got the Guards divisions behind. The Guards divisions were mostly formations such as Western armies might just about recognise. They had some pretty educated, sophisticated people in them, and they were given the best of the equipment. And then behind them in turn, you had this great mass of more or less brutes, mostly from the Soviet Asian Republic.
As the Soviet army pushed onwards, they were fired up with revenge, hatred, and a lust to punish the supporters of Nazism. Rape was commonplace. As they entered the Hungarian capital, Budapest, a young Jewish girl was hiding in a cellar.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
When liberation came, it was the Mongolians, not the White Russian we would expect it to come. They were rough and uncultured, using beautiful books for toilet paper and heating fuel. Of course, the first thing they wanted were women. The first time it happened, they burst into the cellar where I was hiding with two sisters, who I later discovered were baronesses. I will never forget the look on the poor girls' faces as the Russians grabbed them and marched them away to be raped outside, never inside. They were only 14 or 15. Thank God I only looked about 10, if that. I must have been too small and skinny after 3 weeks of literal starvation. Though bestial in many ways, they were specifically on the front line to do the dirty work.
We have to face the fact that the Western Allies needed the barbarians, the soldiers of Stalin, in order to defeat Hitler's tyranny. That if we look at this in the most brutal terms, in the course of the Second World War, American and British ground troops killed about 200,000 Germans. That's in the desert, in Italy and Northwest Europe. The Soviets killed about 3.5 million. So, although, yes, one can take pride in the fact that the Western Allies maintained their civilized values, they needed the savages in order to bring down Hitler.
The West was worried about the Red Army's excesses, but publicly newsreels showed the gratitude of local people liberated by the advancing soldiers.
I'm sure that Stalin would have been aware of Churchill's concerns about the treatment of people in the occupied, the territories being occupied in the East, but frankly there was nothing Churchill could do about it. The British and Americans were still a long way away in the West. The Red Army was advancing at extraordinary speed. And in the Vistula Oder operation, starting in January 1945, they traversed hundreds of kilometers. The Germans were pulling back very fast because, of course, they realized that they were going to have to defend Germany itself.
Stalin was determined that that movement would be as fast and as deep as possible. He saw that the more territory he conquered, the stronger would be his bargaining position at the next conference that would have to be arranged. So he had a much more acute anticipation of the political consequences of the military campaign than was the case of Roosevelt.
When one looks at Roosevelt's foreign policy, what comes out is a desire to constrain Germany, to make Germany realize she'd lost the war, but not to make her so weak that you have a vacuum of power in Europe that the Soviet can just walk over.
Initially, Russia's aspirations, of course, was simply to survive. But when it became apparent that they were going to win the war, then the prospect of overwhelming Germany and dominating Eastern and Central Europe came to the fore.
But towards the end of January, the Germans were still a formidable fighting force, and they constantly refused the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender.
One of the reasons the Germans resist so strongly, both here and in the East, is because of the doctrine of unconditional surrender, which Roosevelt has thrown on the table. But if you're fighting for your homeland and the invaders at the gates, you're going to fight to the last.
They were fighting with the fanaticism of despair, and especially this was true of the very young. This was Goebbels' triumph, that here he had a whole generation of young Germans who'd spent 12 years indoctrinated into Nazism, into a belief that the Third Reich mattered more than life itself. And many Allied soldiers have said that they found one of the worst aspects of this last phase was fighting the children. A 13-year-old with a rifle could kill you as dead as any adult.
German morale was buoyed up by a belief that new weapons would turn the tide of the war.
By early 45, the Germans can thump V2s into Antwerp and on the Rhine bridges and places like that, but everyone knows they're never going to alter the outcome of the war.
Amazingly, despite the Allied strategic bombing, which had been massive and continuous and effective, despite that, the Germans were still manufacturing secret weaponry. I mean, what Hitler always called his secret weapons, the first being, of course, the V-bombs and then these terrifying rocket bombs, which were being produced long after the Normandy landings. So even when the Allies were ashore in Western Europe, or on land in Western Europe, these things were raining down on London and raining down on Antwerp and denying us, of course, a port.
This bombardment by V1 and V2s had seriously dented the morale of the British people. The first V1s were launched in June 1944. One devastated the Guards' Chapel near Buckingham Palace, killing 121 people. The faster and more deadly V2s started to rain down in September 1944 and into 1945. By the end of the war, they had killed over 2,500 Londoners.
Hitler's secret weapons, they'd been expected throughout the war, and then they came. And of course the government was very cagey about revealing information about what they were and denied the effect of them. And of course that is always, in public opinion terms, in morale terms, that's always an absolute disaster. And I think there was a feeling of complete desperation because they were pilotless planes. They seemed more sinister than the bombers. And I think the deaths from the deaths from the B-2s, I mean, things like the Smithfield disaster or the V1s, the Guards' Chapel, were quite devastating to people, even if the statistics weren't necessarily let out.
We had a shelter in the basement, but if we ran to the shelter every time an air raid siren went off, we'd never get any work done. So we'd stay where we were on the 4th floor while the planes came over and the bombs dropped. And then we'd be told, best to run downstairs now, and so we'd go, just in time. I remember the V1 and V2 rockets. I remember looking out of my window and seeing Euston Station go up. A direct hit with a rocket, thousands of pieces of white paper fluttering up in the air.
Other secret weapons were on their way, including long-distance submarines which would enable them to go to the coast of the United States without surfacing, without refueling. So Churchill knew, and the people at the very top knew, this is not going to be a pushover, there's not going to be a sudden surrender.
At the end of January, the Americans continued to make progress in the Pacific. They were preparing for an advance on Manila, the capital of the Philippines. But Japanese resistance was strong, so they realized defeating Japan would be costly. They would need the formidable Red Army to beat Japan. After the break, we'll see how this ended up costing Eastern Europe its freedom. At the start of February 1945, the Allied powers were marshalling their forces for the final assault on Germany. The Germans had fought back fiercely, but the outcome of the war was by now in no doubt. It was just a matter of time. The Red Army's final advance on Berlin had paused, but further east it continued to take over German territory in East Prussia. This land had hardly been touched by war. Its population lived in relative comfort. This was in stark contrast to the privations of the Red Army. And when they saw this, their soldiers looted, raped, and killed civilians on a massive scale. The resulting flood of refugees is one of the biggest single migrations ever. Over 8 million people fled before the advancing Red Army, and many were killed trying to get away. The German generals bravely held open a corridor for their exit, defying Hitler's orders and risking execution.
One of the most extraordinary took place in East Prussia, near the Baltic, in January, February, March 45, when in 4 feet of snow and temperatures 25 below zero, the Soviets were smashing their way into East Prussia, driving more than 1 million civilians before them, men, women, children with their carts and their prams and their barrows, struggling through the snows for survival. And as the Soviets swept into East Prussia, that finally there was only one escape route left across a frozen lagoon, the Frischeshafen, beside the Baltic. And tens of thousands of people were struggling across this with Russian shells falling, smashing holes in the ice, and carts and screaming people falling into it, and scenes of terrible horror. And the German army in those days fought some very gallant actions to keep open that last path into Germany for the refugees from East Prussia.
By the beginning of 1945, it was absolutely essential for the big three to get together, to deal with each other, not through diplomats, but directly. Stalin, as usual, refused to travel abroad, and down in Crimea there were all the old palaces of the Tsars. He could show off.
So Roosevelt and Churchill travelled to the seaside town of Yalta. At previous conferences, they had agreed on the establishment of the United Nations, German reparations to the Soviet Union, and the division of Germany. But each leader had a very different agenda, and each engaged in secret and separate talks when they got to Yalta.
This tension in the three-part relationship is something that the three leaders tried not to let show publicly, but were very aware of privately.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas.
I think the basic question is, how did Churchill see Britain's role now that the United States was playing a major part in securing the victory and when the Soviet Union was making the largest contribution in terms of manpower? He understood that, he accepted that. He fought every day to make sure that the British didn't get shortchanged in terms of what they were doing.
Certainly, Roosevelt's developing the idea that the USSR is perhaps not quite as friendly towards the rest as it might be. And this is curious because for a good part of the war, Roosevelt saw the USSR as friendly, or at least as someone the US could work with. And his perception of the post-war world as not precisely a condominium, but as a world in which the US and the USSR would have some sort of overview. Now, what this does, of course, is deal out the United Kingdom.
Churchill did not trust Stalin, but he didn't know that Roosevelt was also maneuvering behind his back. This double dealing was most obvious in the case of Poland. The British had gone to war over Poland, which now lay in ruins. The exiled Polish government wanted to return, but Churchill knew Stalin had designs on their country. So he wanted to walk away from Yalta with agreement that the Poles would have free elections.
The Yalta agenda was dominated by Poland, where Stalin became, as the official records say, very affable, very friendly. There was a moment when both Churchill and Roosevelt rather nervously sort of asked Stalin, free elections in Poland. Yes, said Stalin. And they thought, well, he can agree to free elections, but when will they be? So they said, can we have them within the year? And Stalin said, why not have them, within 6 months? Why not? Why wait? So, of course, Stalin was posing as being on the side of the angels.
But in reality, Roosevelt was prepared to abandon Poland. The three leaders agreed that at some future date, Poland's borders would move west into Germany, and Stalin would gain territory which suited his political goals.
And for Stalin, security came through having a territorial buffer between himself and Germany. And he found Roosevelt and Churchill were willing to grant him this. Now, why did they make that decision? In early 1945, it looked as if an even more severe war would still have to be fought in the Far East. And the Western Allies badly wanted Stalin to agree, once the war had been won in Europe, to turn his Red Army and put it at the disposal of the alliance against Japan.
In the Pacific, the Americans had won an important naval victory at Leyte, and by the 6th of February, during the Yalta Conference, they had recaptured the Philippine capital, Manila. But a new disturbing phenomenon had emerged during these battles. Suicide, or kamikaze pilots, attacked the American fleet in large numbers and inflicted heavy damage. It was still not clear who would win in the Pacific. The atom bomb remained untested, and the Americans thought they needed the help of the Red Army. This was to seal Poland's fate at Yalta.
The problem for Churchill at Yalta was the American side. But what Churchill didn't know was that Roosevelt had already been negotiating with Stalin on all sorts of elements of the war against Japan. Roosevelt already had a secret agreement with Stalin for American planes bombing Japan to use Siberian air bases. And therefore Roosevelt did not want to pick a quarrel over anything, certainly not over Poland, about which Roosevelt was actually quite cynical. He makes, in the original Yalta transcripts, Roosevelt makes very cynical remarks about the Poles and about the Poles in America, and, they have no influence on me, and, who cares about them? In other words, he didn't have the Churchillian or the British commitment to the Poles as a people in their country, Poland.
As a result, Poland became part of the empire of the Soviet Union, under the heel of Stalin's tyranny.
In recent years, there's been a lot of criticism of Yalta as a supposed betrayal by the Western Allies, and in particular by Roosevelt, because he had the power in a way that Churchill did not. The bald fact was, the Soviets had got there first. To put it bluntly, unless the Western Allies were prepared to fight, to go to war with the Soviets, to save Eastern Europe, which nobody was in 1945 for a moment, the fact was that Stalin had got these countries physically in his grasp.
When the exiled Polish government returned, it was greeted by Stalin's troops and arrested. Free elections were quickly forgotten.
Stalin's attitude was perfectly simple. Stalin said, in Western Europe, those who liberated these countries have imposed the systems of government that they saw appropriate. We think a different system is appropriate. We have liberated the East. We will decide what governments govern in the East.
However, at Yalta, the big three leaders did agree on how they would run Germany.
The first thing was that there should be zones of occupation in Germany. And here Churchill had a very strong dispute with Roosevelt. The Americans didn't want the French to participate in these zones of occupation, and Churchill insisted that they should. And so, as a result of really quite a long fight, as it were, behind the scenes at Yalta between the British and Americans, the French got their zone of occupation.
The Allied powers also agreed at Yalta how the United Nations should be structured, making the Soviet Union, China, the United States, and Britain the most powerful members of it.
This is when the structure of the United Nations was agreed. Negotiations, give and take, came up with an organization that each of the great powers could live with.
Agreement on the long-term future proved easier than on short-term military strategy. While their troops showed fraternal comradeship, the leaders each had their own eyes on Berlin, when Nazism was finally to die. On the 19th of February, the Americans started an offensive onto Japanese territory and landed on the strategically important island of Iwo Jima. The Japanese immediately put them under heavy fire. The Americans lost 4,000 men in the first 2 days. Then for the next month, they advanced slowly across the island. The Japanese were prepared to die in their thousands, and out of a total force of 23,000, all but 216 died, defending what they saw as their sacred land. In Europe, the Germans were also battling to the last. They were fighting local resistance movements street by street. The Allies had yet to advance into the heart of Germany itself.
In the minds of the Western Allies, like their Eastern brethren, Berlin, Hitler's capital, the heart of the Third Reich, was always the symbolic target. The Western Allies, in all their plans and all their conversations, always talked as if Berlin was going to be where they'd end up. And when, for example, representatives of the Dutch, who were suffering terribly under German occupation, were starving in thousands, and the Dutch begged that a few divisions could be diverted to liberate Holland before going on into Germany. And Allied commanders always gave the same answer. They said the best service we can render to all the oppressed peoples of Europe is to get on to Berlin, to end the Nazi tyranny, and then everyone will be free.
To make the Dutch people's lives more desperate and miserable, the Germans flooded acres of land, including fields that could provide them with food. The Dutch daily food ration had fallen to starvation levels. Living in Rotterdam was Anna.
It was bitterly cold and we were all starving. If we could find tulip bulbs, we'd roast them in an old dustbin. We had a bicycle with no tyres. My older two sisters and my father would go east of the city in desperate search of food. We hoped the farmers just might have something. But the nasty Germans would stop them on the way back and confiscate any food they'd found for themselves.
The plight of the Dutch did not go entirely ignored, and food was eventually parachuted in. All over Europe, people were starving, but the Western Allies refused to be diverted from getting to Berlin and trying to keep Poland as part of the West.
It meant that if the Allies could reach Berlin and 100 miles beyond, the Allies and Poland would be contiguous, and therefore Polish independence could be secured. What happened was that Stalin, of course, knew this. He knew the Allied plans. We communicated our plans to him. And so he came to a private arrangement with Eisenhower, which is most extraordinary. And we now have the whole correspondence between Churchill and Eisenhower about it, that Stalin said to Eisenhower, Berlin is no longer important. All the German ministries have moved or are moving south to Leipzig, Chemnitz, Dresden, south. So why don't you advance your armies south, right, and leave Berlin to us, because that's not important. Well, the moment Churchill learned of this, which he did by accident, but by the accident of seeing the armies going in a different direction to what he'd expected, he said, what is this? And Eisenhower said, no, the Soviets say Berlin's not important. And Churchill saw the trap immediately, and Churchill said, but wait a minute, even if all the ministries have left Berlin, which I don't believe because it wasn't true, still Berlin has a psychological importance. Berlin is the German capital. Berlin is where Hitler is.
By now, Hitler had no faith in his military advisors, and as defeat was inevitable, his decision-making became increasingly irrational. He wasted limited German resources on developing secret weapons. Addicted to painkillers and holed up in his bunker, he became deeply paranoid.
He's demented. He's obviously got terrific physical problems. His health is broken, and he's completely lost trust in the general staff and the army. He's acting as his own military commander, and he's become fanatical. For example, he appoints Himmler, of all people, as the commander of the defences of Berlin. Who's quite useless. He's a Nazi party functioning politician, completely the wrong man. But he doesn't trust the army, and really, by this time, Hitler knows the game's up, and he's determined to bring the German people down with him.
The most blameworthy were Germany's generals, who, whatever their military genius, and many of them did possess military genius, they failed their nation and the world because they were the only people who both knew that Germany was losing the war, knew what the Nazis had done, and had the power to do something about it.
As the Allied forces moved through the ruins of Europe, they faced defeated and injured Germans. But many Red Army soldiers were so brutalized that they showed little or no mercy to their enemy. The Germans often fared better at the hands of the Western invaders.
The vast majority of Western Allied soldiers weren't natural killers. They felt miserably unhappy about fighting among villages and towns that looked pretty much like their own villages and towns. And a story always sticks in my mind of a British tank officer who, as they were advancing into Germany, on the edge of a forest, he saw movement, and he saw vehicles moving around, and they swiveled the turret and fired several rounds of high explosive, and then put a couple of bursts of machine gun fire there. And then he said, to his horror, he saw through his binoculars that the people on the edge of the forest weren't German soldiers, they were civilians. And two small figures detached themselves from the wreckage of the carts and the vehicles that they'd shot up and walked towards the thing, and one of them, their children, and they stood and looked up at the turret of his tank, and a little boy, about 10, says in English to the British officer, "You have just killed my father." And the British officer wrote in his diary, "There was nothing I could say."
One event more than any other highlighted the ambiguous attitude the British had towards German civilians: the bombing of Dresden. On the 13th of February, 244 RAF bombers dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on the city, killing 35,000 civilians. The strategic value of the relentless bombing campaign of German cities is the source of vehement disagreement to this day. Among those who think that we shouldn't judge the past by the standards of the present is John Hughes Wilson.
One of the great controversies that's come out of the Second World War is the bombing of German cities. We've really rather agonised about this after the war. That's desperately unfair, and it's revisionist history of the worst kind, because you can't alter what things were like at the time.
People's view, I think, on the bombing of the saturation bombing of Dresden was very mixed. I mean, on the whole, I think there was not the gung-ho attitude that there was in the popular press, the Daily Mail and the Daily Express. There wasn't that. There was a feeling, I think, well, we've had it, why shouldn't they? But I don't think there was this sort of very strong feeling of revenge. I think also there was a degree of apathy. I think people were just so kind of exhausted about their ability, in a sense, to be shocked had somewhat diminished by that time.
Other historians, like Max Hastings, take the view that at the time it was known that there was little strategic value to this bombing.
More bombs were dropped on Germany in this last phase, when the Nazi defences had more or less collapsed and the Allied air forces had reached the zenith of their power, than in the whole of the rest of the war put together. And when you say, what did destroying Dresden and Halle, Leipzig, all those other cities contribute to the end of the war, the answer is virtually nothing.
Dresden is the best-known German city which was carpet-bombed. It is now also known that it was the one city that the Soviet Union specifically asked to be attacked in order to stop German troop movement.
The Soviets knew that some 15 first-class German divisions were moving away from northern Italy, from Central Europe, from Norway, to go against the Russian Eastern Front. And the Soviets were desperate to have Dresden and Leipzig pulverized so that this massive movement of armor wouldn't take place.
The next day, United States Air Force Mustangs, the fighters, come along, and machine gun survivors in the parks. You don't often hear that, but it's a fact as the United States Air Force follow up. So this isn't just a British problem, it's a problem of the whole bombing strategy.
Why in 1945 did they go on bombing cities, the RAF go on bombing cities? And I'm afraid the answer has to be twofold. One, technological fanaticism had sort of taken over, that the fact that you've got this huge bomber force which existed, and you could hardly tell it to do nothing when the Germans were still fighting furiously. And the whole thing had achieved a dynamic momentum of its own. And secondly, because Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the commander of Bomber Command, had become completely personally obsessed with completing the destruction of Germany's cities before the war ended.
One of the most shameful things of the Second World War is the way that Churchill, who has launched this bombing offensive and written warmly to Harris to congratulate him on bombing out German cities, by the time March has come around, he actually retracts and writes a really quite disgraceful memorandum to the chiefs of the air staff saying, I don't think we should do this, and it's nothing to do with me, Gov, and has to retract. And he's doing that because suddenly he realises perhaps the airmen have gone too far for public conscience, but the airmen have only done what the Prime Minister requested and indeed applauded them.
But Churchill was not thinking much about bombing by that stage. In 1940 and 41, he devoted a huge amount of energy and attention to bombing because it was the only way of attacking the Nazis. But by 1944-45, his mind was focused on what the land armies were doing in the future of post-war Europe. In his memoirs, he scarcely mentions bombing in the last volume or two.
There are two distinctly different views on the Allied bombing campaign of German cities, but everyone agrees that by 1945 the war had numbed people to its horrors.
What we're actually seeing here is, if you like, the ratchet effect of war. What in 1939 would have been unthinkable. By 1945 it's become a commonplace. The Second World War shows the ratchet effect of desensitization of human feeling and human psychology. And it's the involvement of civilians that ratchets up the casualties and makes the point the Second World War is a total war.
1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the Big Three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we'll see how in March, the Allied forces face fanatical Nazi resistance. And the Western Allies discover the horrors of the Nazi regime. In April, the Americans finally land on Japanese soil, but at great cost to life on both sides. The Americans allow Stalin to take Berlin as his prize, and Britain starts to realize they're out in the cold. By March, the Western Allies were fighting in Germany. They had crushed Hitler's last desperate attempt to alter the outcome of the war in Europe at the Battle of the Bulge. Winning had been very costly, so the Allies continued to push on, but cautiously.
Everyone thinks that once the Battle of the Bulge is over, that there's then a great lull. Well, there isn't. There are two massive offensives going on. First of all, in the south, the Americans are battering away, and the British and the Canadians are actually fighting in northern Germany, taking really serious casualties until they close up on the Rhine by March. If you look at the casualties that are suffered by the Allies in that period, in that winter fighting, it's actually quite bitter, brutal fighting.
The Western Allied generals had very different approaches to the final assault on Germany, and tensions ran high. Britain's Montgomery pressed hard for a pointed, sharp thrust towards Berlin. However, Eisenhower, the supreme commander, ordered a steady advance into Germany on a broad front.
The British commander, Montgomery, was strongly demanding that the pace of the attack on the Germans should be raised. Eisenhower refused. Eisenhower didn't want to waste American lives in a race for Berlin.
And here was Eisenhower, absolutely determined that although he was going to push on into Germany, he was not going to have any more nasty surprises. He was going to do it very slowly and carefully. And he didn't really see any advantage in pushing hard and fast, because the Allied zones of occupation in Germany had already been agreed. So all they wanted to do was complete the defeat of the Nazis at the lowest possible cost.
The Allies were closing in on both sides. The Red Army was busy bringing up supplies and men for the final assault on Berlin itself. On the 4th of March, they established a bridgehead across the River Oder, just to the east of the city. For the Western Allies, crossing the Rhine was to present a major problem. Retreating Germans had hurriedly blown up all the river's bridges. But there was one still standing at Remagen, which the explosives had only managed to weaken. 2 weeks ahead of schedule, the Americans crossed.
The last great offensive on the west is the attack across the Rhine, and Montgomery, in his rather slow and careful way, closes up, and there's going to be a big set-piece crossing of the Rhine. First of all, the Americans seize the bridge at Remagen and scuttle across it quickly. Hitler's furious and orders the 4 officers to be shot, and he throws everything against the bridge, but by that time the Americans have established a bridgehead.
The Americans' premature crossing of the Rhine infuriated Montgomery, but Eisenhower sent reinforcements to help secure the bridgehead. In fact, the weakened bridge only held for a few days, but it gave the newsreels something positive to report.
Further upstream at Remagen, the Americans are over already. Across the bridge that some patriot of Hitler's Germany forgot to blow properly. But though still a bridge, its girders are cut through. Its weakened steelwork groans under impossible strains. After only a day or so, the entire structure falls into the Rhine, but its job is done. The Americans are over in strength.
Some 8,000 Americans managed to cross the river before the bridge collapsed. The Nazis were prepared to defend their homeland to the last, but they were desperately short of men and firepower. This situation was made worse by Hitler's determination to fight on too many fronts, including the one in Italy, its former ally. Sicily was invaded by the Western Allies in July 1943. Soon after, Mussolini was deposed. The new Italian government surrendered just before the main Allied invasion of Italy started.
We assumed when we entered Italy at the time of the Italian surrender in October 1943 that we would simply advance up Italy. And suddenly we read Hitler's own orders saying that the Germans will put up a fight.
One of the other forgotten fronts that the Germans have to cope with, and the Allies cope with, is Italy. And someone called it the tough old gut, because Churchill had said something like, it's the soft underbelly of Europe. Well, it wasn't. And the Germans actually fought very hard in a 600-day campaign, nearly 2 years. At the end of the day, it actually, ironically, causes the Germans more harm than the Allies, because it gives the Germans 500,000 casualties. So it's a diversion, and if you like, a bleeding sore to Hitler.
Through March, the preparations for the crossing of the Rhine continued. Churchill insisted on seeing the operation personally, despite concerns over his safety. Working as an engineer was William Lowbridge.
I was in the front of the assault in crossing the Rhine. It was our job to bulldoze the ramps down to the river. The Germans were firing heavily at us. There was a huge explosion at one point. I looked behind. 24 men had been hit by a shell that had landed yards away.
Crossing the Rhine was a massive operation, involving nearly 60,000 engineers, the construction of hundreds of pontoons, and transporting tons of supplies. They even used smoke machines to conceal troop movements from the German artillery. The main crossing began on the 24th of March, led by the 15th Scottish Division and followed by 120,000 American troops. At the same time, a massive operation to land paratroopers and gliders behind enemy lines commenced. These courageous men faced fierce ground fire and suffered serious losses.
Typical Montgomery launches this huge, almost mini D-Day crossing the Rhine, where it's very wide, it's 500 yards wide, in some parts it's 1,000 yards wide. He uses marines and landing craft and smoke and bombers, and there's this tremendous set-piece battle where he crosses the Rhine and establishes himself on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and they are like a dagger pointing into the heart of the Ruhr, and it's really the beginning of the end for Germany.
The German soldiers, now out of fuel and food, were forced to beg for supplies from local factories. They were an easy target for the Americans, as 19-year-old Curtis Whiteway witnessed.
I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the field above us. Dead and dying Germans were all over the field, some crying out in great pain, others lay motionless. Some of the wounded started to cry out the names of their loved ones, over and over. Then more cried out as they were dying ever so slowly. It was eerie and ran chills up one's spine to have to sit there and listen to the cries of so many men. It went on for hours as dusk fell. Then slowly, one by one, the men on the field stopped calling out as they died that night.
Now on the other side of the Rhine, the Western Allies did not rush for Berlin. Instead, they moved forward cautiously. They did not want to throw away their men's lives when the end was in sight.
When you had this overwhelming superiority of firepower, of artillery and air power, it was a perfectly natural feeling that if you're infantry soldiers and you're marching along a road and you come under fire, well, there are two ways of doing it. Either you can be a hero and you can get up and throw yourself at the enemy, as a few people did, and most of them were killed, or you can sit there in the ditch by the road and call on the radio for huge artillery bombardment or airstrikes, which will probably winkle out the Germans in a few hours or a few days and may well save your neck.
In the Pacific, the Americans had made headway against the Japanese, but they realized that there was going to be no easy victory.
The Americans are closing in. The Americans are closing in two different directions. One, in the central Pacific, the US Navy is pushing in, heading for the Japanese islands. And then down in the south, you've got MacArthur sweeping up through the Philippines. And these two prongs are pushing in.
The island of Iwo Jima was secured by the 26th of March. The Japanese were also under attack in Burma. British and Indian troops had turned up the pressure. Their strategic aim was to open up a vital supply route into China. By mid-March, they'd recaptured the city of Mandalay. For some months now, Japan had been unable to defend itself from air raids. The Americans had been bombing their cities continuously. Then, in mid-March, they switched to a much more deadly, low-level firebombing strategy.
The United States Army Air Force institutes a campaign to firebomb the Japanese cities. They are hugely successful. The only thing that stops them going on is they actually run out of firebombs.
On the night of the 9th of March, the Americans dropped 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs. Some 16 square miles of Tokyo were destroyed, and over 100,000 people died in the firestorm. It was the most destructive conventional raid of the war against Japan.
The American public were very aware of the firebombing of Tokyo, and the public reaction was largely very positive. It's really interesting to see how American public attitudes towards the use of immense violence against civilians altered during the war. When the war broke out, Roosevelt's first public intervention was to plead for all sides not to descend to the barbarity of attacking civilians. By 1945, the massive scale firebombing of Japanese cities was accepted by the American public. Huge support, and this was opinion polls. 75–80% of the American public approved those kinds of firebombings. Of course, there wasn't reporting in the American media which showed the cost of human lives. There was very little in Time or Life magazine which would give them an impression of the way in which, for example, Japanese people in Tokyo boiled alive by jumping into canals and ponds as the city was burning around them. So in that sense, it was easier for Americans to applaud these kinds of tactics.
In the Pacific, on the 1st of April, the Americans started their invasion of the island of Okinawa. The Japanese allowed them to land on the beaches. As the Americans advanced inland, only then did the Japanese unleash a fanatical attack.
At Okinawa, the Americans also discover a horrible truth about dealing with Japanese civilians. Not only is the whole Japanese garrison killed off eventually, not only do the Americans have to get them out by what they call blowtorch and corkscrew operations, which means basically put a flamethrower down every trench and then throw a grenade in to get the Japanese out. When they finally take the island, the Japanese civilians line up. They have a fantastic last banzai bayonet charge, and they have to be dealt with. The Japanese generals commit mass suicide, and the Japanese civilians jump off the cliff. The fanaticism of Japanese resistance on Okinawa shocks the Americans, it shocks the American planners, and it makes them realize if they're going to try and take Japan proper, it would be like eating a porcupine.
Fighting in the Pacific and Asia would continue for a further 4 months. In Europe, the war was nearly over, but Allied soldiers uncovered the Nazi concentration camps. This was an even greater shock to a world weary of war. In Germany, advancing Allies found a demoralized and impoverished population, and an army that knew it was defeated. Hitler continued to mount desperate counterattacks which made no military sense, but resulted in thousands of deaths. And he ordered retreating forces to destroy as much as they could, blowing up dams and burning buildings.
Hitler, in the last months of the war, made plain that it was a matter of absolutely no interest to him at all who did or did not survive, or what of his own country did or did not survive defeat. And indeed, he seemed to have decided that if he could not have victory, that at the very least he would have a cataclysm worthy of the Third Reich as he saw it. It's as if the Nazis in those last months, there they were clinging by their fingernails to the precipice, and they knew that they were going to fall in. And they just wanted to drag with them as much of humanity as they could possibly achieve.
Once over the Rhine, the Allies attempted to take Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. It is debatable if any real armaments were still being produced there. What is certain is that the Allies found themselves facing an enemy whose morale was finally starting to collapse. They surrendered in large numbers. Securing, housing, and feeding these prisoners of war slowed the Allied advance even further.
In the spring of '45, when the Americans break through and encircle in the Ruhr pocket Model's army with its 400,000 men. And there are many stories told of Germans surrendering en masse when the great psychological collapse happens in April 1945, surrendering to the Allies and saying, now we've got your tanks, will you help us keep the Russians at bay?
The Germans were terrified by the Red Army advance because it was known that the Germans had behaved appallingly in the east, and they knew that they would be shown no mercy by the Red Army troops who'd lost relatives in the fighting on the Eastern Front.
The Red Army had to wait for reinforcements for the final assault on Berlin. Further south, they had liberated Hungary by the 4th of April. And by the 13th, after fierce resistance, they had taken the Austrian capital, Vienna. As the Nazis retreated, they forced millions of prisoners to march back into Germany, rather than allow them to be liberated by the advancing Allies. The Western Allied prisoners had been reasonably well treated during captivity. Now, they found themselves in the same situation as those the Third Reich deemed second-class citizens: Poles, Russians, Gypsies, and other so-called antisocial groups. All were forced on infamous death marches to new camps.
2 weeks later, we were on the move again, this time in cattle trucks southwards to the satellite camps of Buchenwald near Leipzig. But not for long. Soon we were being forced east. We could hear the Americans bombing. After no food, water, or sleep for 3 days, we were wildly hallucinating. It was at this moment 4 of us decided to escape, even though we knew we'd be shot if the sniffer dogs found us. But it didn't matter. Leaving ourselves to the fate of God, we lay hidden in a ditch by the side of the road. Miraculously, the dogs missed us.
Many on these terrible marches were civilians that had been taken from occupied territories and forced to work as slave labor for the Third Reich.
One of the biggest problems for the Nazi Empire in 1944-45 was it was desperately short of manpower, that every man capable of bearing arms had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht or the SS and sent to fight. And that left them desperately short of people to keep the factories going in Germany, to build the tanks, the shells. The only way that they could keep the factories going was by using slaves, conscripted labourers.
There were 7.5 million or so labourers, foreign labourers in Germany, by the end of the later stages of the Second World War. They were extremely badly treated. Many of them died in terrible circumstances, particularly in places like Camp Dora, where the V-2 rocket was manufactured.
It is estimated that by the end of the war, the Germans held as many as 10 million men, women and children as prisoners.
The Nazis also killed at least 3 million Russian prisoners, 3 million, in concentration camps, slave labor camps. And by 1945, imprisonment had become the largest single industry in the Reich.
The Nazis were also holding millions of Jews captive, who they'd planned to kill in the gas chambers of the extermination camps. Though Auschwitz had been found by the Red Army at the end of January, its horrors hadn't been made public in the West. Then, on the 15th of April, the Western Allies entered Belsen.
There had been certainly some knowledge of rumours in the press about the concentration camps in Germany, what was happening to the Jews, but it was really the liberation of Belsen which absolutely shocked. I think nothing had prepared anyone for the horrors that there were there, and they were shown on newsreel, I think on Pathé News, and there was very much the feeling that people must see these. They had a responsibility to see the inhumanity of mankind, and of course, in a sense, a justification of why they had been fighting Germany. You know, they were fighting evil, and this was the manifestation of that.
I've been here 8 days. This morning we buried over 5,000 bodies. We don't know who they are. Behind me you can see a pit which will contain another 5,000.
I am the officer commanding the Regiment of Royal Artillery guarding this camp. Our most unpleasant task has been making the SS, of which there are about 50, bury the dead. Up to press, we have buried about 17,000 people.
My name is Colonel Illingworth and I live at Cheshire. I'm at present in Belsen camp doing guard duty over the SS men.
April 1945.
1945?
Ich heiße Franz Hössler. Ist der 23. April.
The things in this camp are beyond describing. When you actually see them for yourselves, you know what you're fighting for here. Pictures in the paper cannot describe it at all. The things they have committed, well, nobody would think they were human at all.
For some, the impact of what they saw was overwhelming.
Of course, there'd always been stories about Nazi atrocities, but Belsen really brought it home. Belsen was a terrible shock to absolutely everybody.
Another camp, Buchenwald, revealed more atrocities. And then on the 29th, Dachau was liberated. The press and politicians were taken to these camps. It was widely reported, and even department stores put up displays of what had been uncovered.
Swan and Edgar department store at Piccadilly Circus. They cleared their ground floor and brought in the first photographs of concentration camps when the photographs were released in 1945. The newspapers and the radio urged us that we should brave it and go and look at the pictures. Some were very large, some of them life-sized, on the walls. It was a shock of man's inhumanity to man, and everyone was hushed as they walked around, looking.
In the House of Commons, Churchill spoke for the nation, saying, "No words can express our horror." But the discovery of Belsen galvanized the Allies to deal the final blow to the heart of the Nazi regime. By early April, victory was now certain. The Red Army had amassed 2.5 million men at the River Oder. Also within sight of Berlin was the US Army. By the 12th of April, they had crossed the River Elbe near the town of Magdeburg. But then, just a short distance from Berlin, the Americans paused.
But then suddenly, as the Western Allied armies close up to the Elbe, Berlin sort of fades from the picture. And suddenly, Eisenhower sends this signal to Stalin, without consulting anybody, to Churchill's fury, saying there's no intention on our part of going to Berlin. Stalin didn't believe him. He couldn't believe anyone would openly forego the prize. But Eisenhower took the decision, which many of us think was the entirely rational one, that it had already been agreed that Berlin would fall in the middle of the Soviet zone of occupation. What was the point at that last gasp of the war of getting tens of thousands of American and British soldiers killed for a symbolic victory? Stopping at the Elbe was the most rational thing they could have done.
Even before the Allies entered Germany, they had agreed how it would be run once defeated. It would be divided into 4 zones which each ally would occupy and govern.
It was agreed that the demarcation line between the part of Europe occupied by the Red Army and the Soviet Union and by the Western Allies, the British and Americans and French, was going to be the River Elbe. On that basis, there was no point the British and Americans racing for Berlin. On the other hand, Stalin didn't trust the British and Americans, and he thought that they would make a last-minute rush for Berlin if he didn't get there first.
The Allies had agreed Germany's fate, but there was no such agreement about the rest of Europe. The Red Army fought relentlessly in the knowledge that the countries they liberated would be under their control.
I think Stalin wanted to go as far forward as possible. He certainly, for example, wanted to install a communist government in Italy. Now, whether that would have required, had the Soviets reached Italy, clearly that would have been, as in the case of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Albania, it would have meant a Soviet government. So moving forward was important for his political agenda, and he had his people, as far as Italy was concerned, he already had his people ready in Moscow to go and form a government.
Red Army advances were key to Stalin's political objectives. His soldiers were motivated to fight hard, and little notice was taken of their individual sacrifices.
I was part of Red Army liberating forces. We swept across Latvia border to border. At Riga, I was wounded in the right shoulder, but I just continued fighting and moving onwards. Unless you were dead or your leg had been ripped off, no one would send you home for sick leave.
The Western Allies took Nuremberg on the 17th of April and were now deep into eastern Germany. On the 19th, Leipzig fell, and then on the 23rd, they took Frankfurt. Goering, based with most of the military staff at Hitler's Alpine retreat, was disgusted at the loss of Frankfurt. Enraged, he sent the Führer a telegram demanding his resignation. In response, Hitler ordered Goering's arrest, but he was ignored.
The final days for Hitler in April 1945 must be dreadful, because his world has come apart. He's got this Götterdämmerung on the twilight of the gods. He's bringing the German people down in flames, and right at the end, his Nazi party colleagues betray him. Totally. Goering says, "My Führer, as you're trapped in Berlin, I will set up and run the Nazi party from down here."
Berlin was in ruins. There was no electricity and no water. But it was the symbolic prize that Stalin wanted for the Soviet Union. He set two of his generals on a race to take the city.
Stalin was determined to throw the Red Army towards Berlin as fast as possible, and he had a brilliant way of doing this. He took two of his commanders aside, Zhukov and Konev, and without quite saying so in explicit terms, he let it be known that one of them was going to be known as the victor. And it was up to them to race to Berlin, to smash through the German defences, and whoever won, won.
But Zhukov and Konev had a particular rivalry, and what Stalin therefore did was to essentially organise a race. What happened was that Zhukov got stalled, and it took him 3 days to fight his way up onto this rather difficult obstacle.
His men struggled through sodden ground covered in landmines. They faced a German army with nothing left to lose. Finally, after 3 days, they broke through. And then their artillery started to batter the outskirts of Berlin.
Meanwhile, Konev, his penetration was much, much more successful, and he stumbled across one of the first autobahns, a motorway, which goes straight up into the south of Berlin.
A city that was now defended by old men and boys.
One of the things the Germans do towards the end, Hitler does, he brings out what's called the Volkssturm, who are old men and young children. These are basically kids and old men who are given an anti-tank bazooka and sent out to hold the line against the advancing hordes.
On the 21st of April, Zhukov's army started its final assault on Berlin. The two generals had massed nearly 500,000 men against just 45,000 German troops, 40,000 old men and 3,000 children.
I think it's very hard for us in the West to understand just how big the Soviet offensive was. 160 divisions closing in on Berlin, massive effort. 300,000 Russians killed, I think, in the fighting before Berlin. These are colossal casualties and give some idea of the effort the Soviets put in.
Zhukov and Konev had shown themselves through the battles of the last 2 years to be probably the most brilliant commanders of large forces in the Second World War. And yet, in their burning impatience and rivalry to be the first into Berlin, goaded by Stalin all the time, saying which of you is going to become the hero of the Berlin battle, they threw away their lives, their men, with a recklessness that no Allied commander would have dreamed of.
In the last few terrible days of fighting, Germans were also sacrificed in their tens of thousands. Those not killed by the Red Army's onslaught were executed by the SS if they dared to hide from the fighting to save their own life.
And there's one very good story told about a young lad who's in the front line fighting for Berlin, and his house is just 2 blocks away. So he leaves the front line just to see his mum. He's not deserting, he's just going to see her and go back again. And on the way, 1 block away, he's stopped by a Nazi Party official or a Gestapo chap who says, "Who are you doing? What are you doing?" And he's hanged on a lamppost, a block from his mother's house, as an example, allegedly, to all the rest who might desert. Of course, they won't, because they're fighting for their lives, with a sign around his neck saying, "I'm a deserter." And that's one of the many tragic little stories of Berlin and the young fighters of Berlin in the last days, many of whom actually died in the rubble.
By the 27th of April, the Red Army had reached Alexanderplatz, the center of Berlin. They were just half a mile from Hitler's bunker on Wilhelmstrasse. The final pockets of German resistance had to be flushed out. But after so much sacrifice, the ultimate prize, Hitler's surrender, would elude the Red Army. For 4 long years, the Eastern and Western Allied soldiers had fought the Nazis. Finally, the 2 Allied forces met face to face at Torgau on the River Elbe. On the 25th of April, American and Soviet Union soldiers shook hands.
Then on the Elbe River, boats cross and men wave from opposite banks. With the meeting of Russians and Americans, Germany has been cut in half. The end is now very near indeed. The end that all cannot wait to see.
I think it's very interesting, the reaction of the Americans and the British when they first encountered the Soviets coming from the east. I think they were surprised at the sophistication of the forward elements of the Red Army. There's a famous quotation from one British soldier who said that a tank commander was covered in aerials and looked like a man from Mars. We also see film of the Americans meeting the Russians at Torgau on the Elbe, and the Russians are all carrying rather nice cameras, which have presumably been looted from Germans. But the Red Army by 1945 really looks like a professional army.
The Allied generals had ignored the agreed zones of occupation in order to beat Germany. But now that the Nazis were on their last legs, political maneuvering between the big 3 Allied powers began.
The American troops actually advanced very far into the areas which were allocated to the Soviets. The Soviets got Berlin, which was surely the greatest prize, but the American troops advanced right through the area allocated to the Soviets. So the dispute between Churchill and Eisenhower and between Churchill and Roosevelt was, don't withdraw your troops. Now at least you've got so far into Germany, don't withdraw your troops until we have a proper arrangement with the Soviets. And the Soviets said, no, this is our area, leave it to us. And so Eisenhower pulled back his troops, and Churchill was, to put it mildly, very distressed. He felt Eisenhower doesn't understand the political aspect, and he uses that argument with Eisenhower. He's quite open about it. You don't understand the political aspect.
And Stalin was absolutely determined that the USSR would come out of the Second World War a global power respected by the United Kingdom and especially by the United States of America.
The only thing that Churchill was able to do, and that was when we learned that the Soviets were planning to enter Denmark and to control the whole of the Baltic. And therefore, Churchill ordered Montgomery to go straight across north of Berlin, ignore Berlin, go to the Baltic shore, and cut the Soviets off from Denmark. So that was one area where, if you like, the British policy of minimizing the Soviet advantage in the last months and weeks of the war was effective.
In Italy, the Nazis were retreating. With his protectors gone, Mussolini, the fascist dictator, was flushed out by Italian resistance forces. They captured and shot him and his mistress, Clara Petacci, on the 28th of April. Their bodies were put on public display in Milan. In Germany, the Nazis were also facing their last few days.
For a minority of Germans who were committed, fanatical Nazis, particularly in organisations like the SS, of course, the defeat was something they were very reluctant to accept. And these are the people who wanted to keep on fighting and who were very much inclined to commit suicide if they did not, once they realised that it was all up. Something between 10 and 20% of all the senior Nazi leaders killed themselves, the regional leaders, the Gauleiter, the top members of the SS. So a large number of the top echelons of the most committed and fanatical Nazis saw absolutely no future and thought that they were dying a kind of sacrificial death for Germany.
The Second World War, at least tens of thousands, many tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, we shall never know for sure, of Germans kill themselves in their despair because they believed that after the Third Reich there would be nothing, there would be just emptiness, there would be no future for them at all.
A teenage girl wrote in her diary about the terrible price some women had to pay in defeat.
She was 17 and she described very vividly service with the Nazi Labour service, and then how she and her sister were cowering in their apartment in Berlin with their parents when the Red Army burst in. And both the girls were repeatedly raped. And the girl wrote in her diary, and I was still not yet 18. And when the Red soldiers left and the family were left sobbing, their mother said to them, "Your honour is gone, you have nothing left to live for. You can only die." Their own mother took these girls up on the roof of their apartment building and told them to jump, while their father stood on the pavement underneath and implored them not to. Well, in the end, after 10 minutes, the girls burst into tears and ran back in the building and survived.
Hitler's bunker was surrounded, but he refused to be taken alive. On the 29th of April, Hitler wrote his last will and testament. He then married his mistress, Eva Braun.
And he then discovers, just before he commits suicide, that Himmler, the Trauerheimlich, has actually set up quite illicit peace talks with the Swedes. And Hitler, in his rage and his bunker right at the end of the day, realises his old trusted colleagues have betrayed him.
The next day at 3:30 p.m., Hitler shot himself. His mistress killed herself with poison. Hitler's body was then incinerated by SS bodyguards. The petrol cans were found later. The Red Army had focused their firepower on the German parliament.
It's particularly interesting that they went not for the chancellery below which the Führer's bunker was. They actually went for the Reichstag, the old German parliament building. Now, actually, the Reichstag had been gutted by fire in 1933, so it was a ruin. But on the front of the Reichstag, it says, over the entrance, it says, "Dem deutschen Volk," to the German people. And I think that symbolism may have been one reason why the Russians made that the target which would certify victory, because it was their revenge against the Germans. Also, of course, the Reichstag was a huge building. It was relatively isolated. It's surrounded by quite open terrain.
Thousands of fanatical Nazis had dug in around the Reichstag. They wanted to die defending the glory of Germany. The Red Army soldiers had to fight each and every one to take this last remaining symbol of the German state. Then finally, late in the evening of the 30th of April, 2 men climbed into the remaining shell of what had once been Germany's parliament and hoisted the red victory banner.
The film shows the red flag, the famous victory banner, being hoisted over the Reichstag. Now, the film is a reconstruction because when the flag was actually hoisted, it was dark. It was the night of the 30th of April.
Some friends and I went to the Reichstag. Our immediate reaction was to write something like, "The Russian occupying forces were here," but we had nothing to write with. But I was proud of my country and my army. We had managed to free so many people from the fascists.
Germany had been defeated. Europe was overrun, countries and people destroyed. But the Allied leaders soon realized that a new battle for control of Europe was about to begin. 1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the Big Three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we see how in May, victory was celebrated, while behind the scenes, political tension was mounting between the Allies. By July, a new world order emerges, dominated by 2, not 3, superpowers. And we'll see how veiled threats and broken promises in the summer of 1945 shaped the political future of Europe for the next 50 years. At the beginning of 1945, the 3 great Allied powers, the Soviet Union, America, and Britain, were engaged in the last stages of the war in Europe, even though the war in the Pacific was far from over. During February and March, the Soviet Union took Central and Eastern Europe, and the British and the Americans took the North, South, and West. By early April, Hitler was holed up in his bunker in Berlin, but he ordered his armies to fight on, even though defeat was inevitable. The Allies discovered concentration camps in Poland and Germany, further proof, if any were needed, of the full horror of the Nazi regime. On the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. That evening, the Soviet Union took Berlin, and victory in Europe was imminent. But for America, any sense of relief or expectation was overshadowed by events at home. Earlier in the month, President Roosevelt, who had led America for 3 consecutive terms, suddenly died. He was buried on April the 15th. Leela Arida was living in Brooklyn at the time.
We heard the news over the radio. Everyone was in the street telling friends and neighbors and hanging out of the windows saying, "Did you hear?" I went to tell my friend who lived next door, and then I told my aunt, who began to cry. On the day of his funeral, people lined the streets all the way from Georgia, some 1,000 miles. Roosevelt was like a father figure to us all.
The death of Roosevelt came as a profound shock, not only to the United States, but also to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union.
For the British forces, the American forces, it was a blow, because Roosevelt had become the symbol of the American fighting power, and a symbol which he had rather carefully sort of nurtured.
The United Kingdom, of course, felt that it lost an ally who understood it and with whom it didn't always agree, but nevertheless was convinced of his goodwill. Now, in the United States, of course, it was a traumatic, transforming experience, not least because a wholly unknown man became president.
It is with a heavy heart.
This man was Harry Truman, who was virtually unknown on the international diplomatic scene.
Poor old Harry Truman, stepping into FDR's shoes. The shadow of FDR fell over Truman's presidency in a way that Truman himself was acutely aware of. There was a scrum of reporters outside, and Truman said, "Nice to see you boys." He knew all the Capitol Hill reporters. And he said, "I don't know if you fellas have ever had a load of hay fall on you, but yesterday when I heard the news, the moon, the planets, and all the stars fell on me." And it was an amazing kind of revelation of the way he really thought. He was terrified, I think, and completely aware of his own lack of preparedness for the role that had been thrust upon him. Truman was a farm boy from Missouri. He'd had no education beyond high school. He was a plain-spoken, ordinary man who made much of his ordinariness. Even in the short time that he'd been vice president, Roosevelt hadn't taken him into his confidence. Roosevelt hadn't told him about any plans he might have for how to deal with Stalin and Churchill. So he was on a very, very fast learning curve when he came into office.
That America will continue the fight for freedom.
In his first public speech, Truman promised to continue America's war effort, demanding nothing less than unconditional surrender from Germany and Japan.
Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
In Europe, at least, surrender was not far away. On the first day of May, the Red Army under General Zhukov took Berlin. The Allies were now in control of Europe, but still faced resistance.
All the German soldiers had given up fighting. On our way into the marketplace, we ran into senior German officers taking off insignia that would identify them. They asked if the British had arrived. Finally, we saw the town's civilian authorities surrender the key to the British. I was expecting the British to look like the British devils of the propaganda portrayals. But instead, they looked just like us.
The Second World War in Europe did not end cold one day with suddenly all the guns falling silent. It sort of trickled and faltered to a stop, like an old-fashioned gramophone running down.
The Germans were terrified by the Red Army advance because it was known that the Germans had behaved appallingly in the east, even worse than they had in the west. And they knew that they would be shown no mercy by the Red Army troops who'd lost relatives in the fighting on the Eastern Front.
A lot of German soldiers, and especially the SS people, felt that there was nothing to gain from giving up. They might just as well fight on. And I've met Red soldiers who told me about being in battles well into May, second, third week of May 45, where they just encountered groups of Germans who were still shooting, because what was the point of being taken prisoner if you thought you were going to die? In those last days of the Third Reich, hysteria and despair prevailed. Generals killed themselves in their hundreds. Officials kill themselves in their thousands, and ordinary civilians in their tens and hundreds of thousands.
Hitler himself, Goebbels and his wife and their children killed themselves. Himmler committed suicide when he was captured. Goering later on, after he'd stood trial and was faced with execution by hanging, which he thought was unmilitary. There's a letter written by Goebbels' wife, Magda Goebbels, just before she and her husband killed their 6 children and then killed themselves in the bunker right at the end of the war, where she says, I'm going to do my children a service because life will be completely pointless, will not be worth living without National Socialism. so we're all going to die.
With no hope left, finally, on the 2nd of May, the Germans sent envoys to meet Montgomery to agree terms for peace. 2 days later came unconditional surrender. But at the very moment of victory, the Allies were arguing among themselves in a foretaste of far greater trouble to come.
Keitel from Hitler's headquarters signed a surrender document at Eisenhower's headquarters at Reims on May the 7th. But then the Soviets were enraged that they hadn't had senior people at it and insisted the whole thing was redone a day later in Berlin with their proper delegation and commissars present. And you pays your money and takes your choice, which could be considered the real German surrender.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. The German war is therefore at an end.
People greeted the news with a mixture of joy and relief that the nightmare was finally over.
At the end of the war, my mother showed my sister and me a packet of cyanide she had got from the family pharmacy in Zagreb and was determined to administer to us should the Nazis have invaded England. She was not going to have others decide where and when we should die. I asked whether she would now destroy it. She said no, and having shown us the packet of white powder, returned it to the rear of the shelf in Father's wardrobe.
In Moscow, the Soviet Union celebrated the extraordinary success of Stalin's Red Army and the Soviet people.
The Soviet Union had enormous reason to feel incredibly proud of itself. It had not only liberated all of the territory of the Soviet Union as it had been before 1941, it had also moved into Eastern and indeed deep into Central Europe and was across more than half of Germany. It had captured the German capital. It was the strongest land power in the world. It was one of the 3 strongest air powers.
Stalin was determined to celebrate properly the victory in the war with a great military parade across Red Square. So there he was, standing on the top of the mausoleum, Zhukov coming across Red Square on the white Arab stallion, announcing to Stalin that victory had been achieved, and then the parade of all the regiments with their spoils, the banners of the Wehrmacht, which they threw at his feet to signal that Germany had been unconditionally defeated by the might of the Red Army.
In London and across Europe, Britons also celebrated.
As the hour of 3 p.m. drew near for Churchill's speech, groups of people, both indoors and out, gathered around any available wireless set. Suddenly everyone became quiet.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
And I remember looking around and catching the eyes of 1 or 2 people, and it seemed as if the same expression of thankfulness and pleasure could be read in each.
What happened on V-Day was really basically everybody took the day off. It was a public holiday for most people. You know, they dressed up. There was a tremendous desire to come to London, to be in the capital, to be where it was at, to sort of throng down the Mall, to celebrate outside Buckingham Palace. And bunting in the street and flags and drinking and dancing and doing the conga. Some interesting stories about older evacuees who were determined to get on a train and make sure that they were in London for the celebration.
But for Churchill, victory was just a brief reprieve from new anxieties. Stalin now occupied vast swathes of Eastern Europe, and there was no indication that he planned to leave.
At VE Day on the 8th of May, when everybody was celebrating and he appeared before the crowds in Whitehall, he made his great speeches, London, the great hippopotamus, the great rhinoceros, which had survived all these bombardments. His Prime Minister's box was filling up with all the problems relating to the Soviets in Yugoslavia, in Poland. it cast a very grave shadow over his celebration of the victory.
Victory signalled the beginning of a new battle between the superpowers for ultimate control of Europe. Peace would be almost as traumatic as the war itself. On the 8th of May, the Nazis had surrendered to the Allies. But this also marked the moment when the Allied wartime coalition began to crumble. Europe was now divided between the Red Army in the east and the American and British armies in the west. Behind these lines, the countries liberated from the Nazis were now controlled by new occupying forces who would determine their fate.
There was a great degree of disagreement between the so-called Big Three, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States of America as to the future of those states that had been under German occupation in Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union was adamant that these states were either liberated or going to be liberated by the Red Army, and so they would have to have a great degree of say as to the future governments and political systems in these countries.
The Soviet Union was determined that they have a cordon sanitaire, that there be buffer states between it and the Western powers. The United Kingdom worried about this because for centuries, for 1,000 years, the main foreign policy of the United Kingdom is not to have a single great power on the European continent. And here was the fear that, in fact, Germany had tried through 2 world wars, she'd been defeated, and here comes the Soviet Union, essentially a continent itself, now threatening to be this dominant power.
In Great Britain, and especially Winston Churchill, there was a feeling that democracy had to be the trademark. Democracy had to be the mainstay of all these political systems, so there was a great degree of aggravation about the prospect of numbers of Eastern European countries being dominated by the Soviet Union.
The principle of democracy for all had been established at a peace conference in Yalta in February. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had agreed that all nations previously under German control would have democratic governments and free elections. But by mid-May, it became clear that for many countries in Eastern Europe, this was not going to happen. As the Soviet Union replaced the Germans, they brought their own political system, imposed through Stalin's secret police, the NKVD.
With the Red Army came the NKVD, came Soviet governmental officials, came party representatives, and Stalin made sure that Soviet control was tight in all of the countries of Eastern Europe. Stalin wanted to anesthetize any possible threat from anti-communist groups in the countries that the Red Army had liberated from Nazism. The police forces sent in by Stalin from the USSR rounded up known Nazi sympathizers, rounded up members of the middle and upper classes, moved in on all of the elites who were judged to be hostile to communism, so that the prisons started bulging.
Everything that had been constructed at Yalta, which was based on why Britain had gone to war and why Britain and America had defeated Nazism, was to produce a better world. And here we are, there's victory, there's still celebration going on in the streets, and Churchill knows that everything is going sour. That behind this Iron Curtain, things are going on, which I think Churchill uses the phrase, this isn't the war, this isn't the world we fought for.
What the Americans thought of Churchill was that he was being over-concerned. He didn't really understand that the new world was going to be different. And so the tensions between the British and the Americans were there because they had different views of the threat of the Soviet Union and different views of what might happen to Europe.
Britain had gone to war over Poland, so Churchill was particularly concerned for its future. Stalin had agreed to hold free elections there, but had now installed his own government and arrested the main opposition leaders.
had fought in the Polish resistance in Warsaw until it fell to the Germans and we were sent to Auschwitz. When the Americans finally freed us, the big question was, do we go back to Poland? Already we had got word that it was starting all over again, that the Russians had sent resistance fighters to Siberia. One day I received a letter from my mother saying, "Don't come back." So we decided to join the Polish army in Italy.
Poland was absolutely crucial to the buffer zone that Stalin wanted to create in Eastern Europe, because so much trouble had come to Russia from Poland in centuries past, and indeed in the 20th century. So it was crucial for Stalin to assert that the Soviet Union had a special interest in having a comfortable relationship with the new Polish government, and that basically meant a government in Poland of which Stalin himself personally approved.
The war ended on the 8th of May, and Churchill was astonished 4 days later, on the 12th of May, to learn that the Americans were already planning to withdraw and about to withdraw troops from Europe. But the withdrawal of these troops really sent a signal to Stalin that the United States was not going to be in a position to insist on the fulfillment of any of the Soviet pledges. And it came just as the fate of the Polish negotiators, who were meant to be the future leaders of an independent Polish government, was announced. They'd been seized by the Soviets outside Warsaw, taken to Moscow, put in the Lubyanka prison, and had been charged and found guilty of all sorts of spurious Soviet charges. But these were the people who Stalin had agreed at Yalta were to be an integral part of a new, broad-based, all-party Polish government.
It's a terrible moment that for Churchill, the sense that after everything Britain had endured, Poland had fallen into the Soviet maw and unspeakable misery, and Britain, which had gone into the war still as one of the richer and greatest nations on earth, had fallen from the first rank of powers.
But while on the international scene the Soviet Union was displacing Britain, for the people of both countries, day-to-day life in peacetime was as harsh as it had been in war. The Soviet Union was a country in ruins. Devastated by the enormous effort it took to win the war.
The cost of the war for the Soviet Union and its impact is unimaginable. The best estimate is that a total of 27 million people died as a more or less direct result of hostilities, including about 8 million actual battle dead. And one of the most striking images, which is recorded in Soviet writers of the time, is gangs of orphan children roaming the streets, begging because all the adults had been killed.
Stalin was a very worried man at the very moment of victory over Germany, because he knew what a dreadful condition the USSR was in. The destroyed economy, the ruined administration, the huge responsibilities of reconstruction.
Stalin knew he was going to have to use brute force to get his people to rebuild their country. His troops had seen, even in the depredations of war, a better life in the West, and were returning home full of hope and expectation, but to face nothing.
They had seen a much more orderly society. They had seen shops and churches open. They had seen a standard of living in some of these countries that they had previously thought unimaginable in the world. Stalin was going to arrest anyone who called for a relaxation of the regime among the civilian population, and he was going to astound Soviet people with his ingratitude for what they had done for him and his regime in the war. He was going to clamp down as never before.
Stalin began to round up returning soldiers suspected of being potential dissidents or anyone else who might be an anti-communist. In public, relations between the big three looked cordial, but behind the scenes, a diplomatic war was raging. Churchill was losing his fight against a Europe dominated by the Soviet Union. The fallout would have a devastating impact for decades to come. By June 1945, Europe was under Allied occupation. In Poland and much of the East, Stalin's secret police were purging anti-communist factions. This was an open violation of the Allies' agreement for a free and democratic Europe. But there were other diplomatic wrangles to resolve. The future of Germany had long been the source of vehement disagreement.
There were various plans throughout 1944 and early 1945 as to what would happen to Germany at the end of the war.
There was an idea in 1944, the Morgenthau Plan, that Germany essentially be reduced to a sheep pasture. Pastoralization of Germany, it was called.
The Allies couldn't really agree. They just couldn't agree. Stalin wanted a neutral Germany. The Western powers, of course, did not want to see a neutralized Germany completely, but nonetheless, they didn't want to see a resurgent Germany.
And if you're not going to reduce it to nothingness, how are you going to control it? And who gets to control it? And so it's decided that it's going to be broken up into zones, so each of the Allies, plus France, have their own zone.
On the 3rd of July, the Allied forces moved into their assigned zones.
The French got a very small part of Germany, and basically in the southwest, the part that was closest to France itself. The Americans took over south and much of central Germany. The British occupied the north, with the exception of Bremen, because the Americans wanted a seaport leading into the North Sea. And then the Russians, the Soviet Union, took over the east, which later, of course, became the German Democratic Republic, and the line drawn more or less vertically down some way across the middle of Germany. And then Berlin was itself divided, again, into 4 sectors.
The occupying Allied forces faced an immediate problem. There were millions of displaced people on the move across Europe, many of them trying to find their way home or to a place of refuge.
I had been taken away by the Nazis to Austria as a slave. After the war, I wanted to get home. I asked a Russian officer for help, but we were only taken as far as Hungary. Then I discovered we were going to be sent to Japan to fight for Stalin. That was it. I was never going to fight for Stalin, and started looking for a fellow deserter. It felt like months to walk back to Austria, our desired destination, where there were about 500,000 political refugees like me, with nowhere to go. Here I found a British catering corps transit camp. At my first breakfast, they asked me what I'd like. I could have anything, eggs or whatever, but I wanted bread. It was the first time I tasted bread since my mother had made me some in 1942.
The Nazis had drafted in well over 7 million forced labourers to help with the war industries and many other things. So you had, in addition to the German population, the slave labourers who were trying to get home, displaced persons. Slave labourers often became reclassified as displaced persons, and then German refugees from the east, all milling around, mostly in the Allied sectors, though not exclusively so, creating further problems of supply and keeping things going.
Amongst the millions of displaced people were Jewish survivors, for whom the horrors of the Holocaust redoubled their desire for their own homeland.
A few 100,000 Jews had survived in Europe during the war. Most of those Jews were living in what had been the concentration camps. Of course, they were no longer prisoners. They could walk out, but they had nowhere to go. They were generally housed in the barracks of their former guards. Most of them remained there, hoping that they could qualify for emigration, and many of them demanded admission to Palestine.
They would join thousands of Jewish people who had officially emigrated to Palestine before the war.
We were very glad the war was over, but there was also the shadow of finding out who had lived and who had died back in Europe. My mother never knew where her own mother had disappeared. We found out later she had died on a train on her way to a death camp. The big thing in my life was the secret Zionist army, the Haganah. Everyone I knew was in it, but it was very hush-hush. My main job was to guard Haifa's Jewish quarter against Arab attacks. I also did nursing at a British camp where European Jews who had arrived here illegally were being detained. It was good for them to be able to talk to someone who was already living here in what one day would be Israel.
In 1945, Palestine was under British control as part of its empire in the Middle East.
During World War I, the British had made promises to everybody. They'd promised the Jews in the Balfour Declaration of 1917 that they would facilitate the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, with certain provisos. They had promised the Arab nationalists the creation of a great Arab state. The British found themselves saddled with responsibility for what was called by many people a twice-promised land, and it was argued by both sides that promises had been made and promises had been betrayed. In Palestine itself, about 30% of the population at this time was Jewish and about 70% was Arab. The Zionists hoped to create a majority in Palestine by bringing about a large wave of immigration, both of displaced persons and of other Jews who had survived in Europe. But the Arab nationalists, of course, were dead set against the idea that they should be turned into a minority in their own country. And so they strongly resisted the idea that there should be any immigration whatsoever. When the war ended, the pent-up frustrations, both among the Zionists and among the Arab nationalists in Palestine, boiled over.
This frustration led Zionist militants to escalate their attacks against British troops. In 1947, the British decided to pull out and handed over responsibility for Palestine to the newly established United Nations.
I have been instructed by His Majesty's government that they have consequently decided they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
In 1948, Palestine was forcibly partitioned, with the larger part of the country becoming the new state of Israel, still a source of grievance and conflict today. This is just one legacy of the great political upheaval which took place in the immediate aftermath of the war.
The pattern in southeastern Europe was not much different from the pattern in other parts of Europe, when in a sort of political vacuum, rival organizations were at each other's throats to try and achieve some kind of political supremacy. In Yugoslavia, the situation was less favorable for the Soviet Union because here you had a nationalist, communist resistance organization which had grown into a massive political force. And by the end of the war, with the retreat of the German occupying forces, this was the force that really captured and created the state of Yugoslavia, but it was not necessarily a force which was simply going to be subservient to the Soviet Union.
In the Baltic states, there was guerrilla resistance to the Soviet reoccupation, which continued throughout the late 40s and 50s. In the Ukraine also, there was a great deal of partisan resistance to the Soviet reoccupation. They were not welcomed as liberators by any means in the Western Soviet Union. And the NKVD, the Interior Ministry forces, waged a long and hard campaign against partisans in these areas long after the fighting finished.
In southern and eastern Europe, dramatic regime changes were underway. People found themselves living under yet another repressive regime, sowing the seeds of conflict that would resurface decades later. The issue of who would control Europe would have to be resolved between the big three. After the break, we'll see how President Truman was to dramatically change the relationship between America and its wartime allies. By July 1945, a defeated Germany was divided into Allied zones of occupation. The east of Europe was under the control of the Soviet Union, and the west under the British and Americans. There were signs of political struggle and unrest throughout Europe. The dominance of the Soviet Union worried Churchill, but he also had pressing matters to deal with back home. In July, the wartime coalition government under his leadership was dissolved. Britain returned to party politics. For the first time in 10 years, there was to be a general election.
I think the main thing about the mood of the country at that time was a desire for change such as had not existed since 1918. People felt very strongly that they hadn't gone out and fought and died in order to go back to the same unfair society that they'd known in the 30s, that they wanted something new and better and freer and fresher and fairer.
An awful lot of the British people felt that they'd had enough of government by perceived toffs. They felt the toffs had got them into this mess, and they'd had enough of it all, and they were set upon a more equal and just society, which was going to be run by people who did not look and sound like the people who got them into the frightful mess in 1939.
There was a desire, a quite complex feeling about what was wanted from this post-war world. And in a sense, there was very much the feeling that there had got to be a better Britain. On the one hand, you had a desire for a return to normality. On the other hand, that normality somehow had to be better.
Labour fought the 1945 election essentially on the basis of the Beveridge Report, which had advocated a system of national insurance, a system of ensuring that everybody was educated, that nobody starved in the streets, that there was a safety net beyond which nobody was to be allowed to fall.
The election was held on the 5th of July 1945. Over 70% of the population voted, including British servicemen and women all over the world. But it would take 3 weeks to collect and count their ballots. Churchill and Attlee would have to wait to find out who would lead post-war Britain. But international politics continued regardless. In mid-July, the Big Three were to meet at Potsdam in Germany to decide the future of Europe.
Churchill, as a precaution, took Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, to Potsdam with him, just in case the worst happened and Labour won the election.
This was the first time all three Allied leaders had been on German soil since the war began, and Churchill and Truman took the opportunity to tour Berlin before the Potsdam meeting.
Churchill had seen, on a fairly regular basis, film taken by RAF planes of the bombing of German cities, but that was taken from 8,000 feet or 10,000 feet. But like everybody, he hadn't seen it from the ground. Suddenly to come to this city, and in fact go round with Truman, they travelled around together, neither man had seen it, and he was very shocked, both by the devastation and also by the refugees. He was astounded by the desperate situation of the Berliners who had nothing.
The Berliners could be seen scurrying amongst the rubble with their pathetic bundles. They looked and acted like rats by disappearing into the man-made holes leading to basements of large department stores. A few I saw who came out of hiding were pasty-looking, emaciated, and looked so very much older than they were. These people Hitler had declared were the master race. If only they knew what their destiny held for them.
On the agenda for discussion were the future of Germany, including the amount of war reparations they would pay, and the future of Poland and liberated Europe. Each of the Allied leaders wanted a very different result, so negotiations were tense.
Potsdam itself, as a conference, was not a peace conference which included, for example, representatives of the defeated German nation or the defeated Italian nation. It really was a conference between the big three again, the USA, the USSR, and Great Britain, to try and thrash out their relationship in the future.
Churchill went to Potsdam with two separate objectives. One was to have one last attempt to persuade Stalin to restore, because they'd now been subverted, restore freedoms to Poland, the country for which Britain had gone to war. But as he had never met Truman before, his second objective was to really have a conference similar to the ones he used to have with Roosevelt to settle the outstanding issues in Anglo-American relationships.
Truman, as far as one can tell, had a slightly suspicious view of the United Kingdom, which indeed was common with much of his part of the country, which is more or less the middle South, one might say, the northern part of the South, which didn't have any basic links with the United Kingdom and saw Great Britain as a competitor rather than a natural hands-across-the-sea ally.
The Americans' primary objective was to assert their power over the Soviet Union.
Now, when Truman became president, he'd had no preparation, particularly in foreign policy. And, of course, he turned to Roosevelt's advisors. And they decided with the new president this was the opportunity to bring, as it were, some realism into foreign policy making. These advisors came up with the idea of quid pro quo. That is to say that if Stalin wanted something, he had to give something, because they had the perception that the United States was surrendering points or territory to Stalin and not receiving anything in return.
Stalin at Potsdam wanted Soviet interests to be protected in Eastern Europe. He wanted Poland to be moved westwards and the USSR to take up the space vacated. He wanted reparations from the Germans in payment for the damage that they'd done in the USSR, and he wanted the Western Allies to confirm all of this.
Truman felt he could take a tough line with Stalin because he had a new secret weapon. On July the 16th, the atom bomb had been successfully tested in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Truman believed the bomb would help both to defeat Japan and to assert control over the Soviet Union.
Truman very clearly assumed that the possession of the bomb would be an incredible ace in the hole for him, that if worse came to worse, he could actually announce this, and the Soviets would strike back in awe and wonder, in shock and awe, one might say, at the weapon the United States now possessed.
And when Truman said cunningly to Stalin that he had a little secret, he wanted to share with Stalin a little secret that might astound Stalin. Stalin, of course, knew what the secret was already from his intelligence agents. He knew that he couldn't trust the United Kingdom or the USA because he had an understanding that this is how great powers operated against each other. He thought that economic rivalries would produce political and military tensions in the post-war world. And he thought that eventually there would be a Third World War.
Of course, what Truman didn't know was that Stalin already knew the United States had the bomb. And therefore, it didn't come as such a profound surprise. What the bomb did for Truman was give him massive self-confidence in this debut on the world stage. The Americans had the overwhelming weapon, and the Soviets didn't.
This was the dawn of the atomic age. Possession of the bomb was to dominate world politics for the next 60 years. In July, Stalin was already secretly developing his own bomb. But until it was ready, he had little leverage on issues like reparations. All he could do was remind the Allies of the great sacrifice the Soviet people had made to win the war. But Truman saw no value in a Germany weakened further by excessive reparations and demanded a reduction in the Soviet Union's share. In return, Stalin insisted on a newly expanded Poland, governed by leaders under his control. The two great powers struck a deal And Churchill, who had fought for Poland's freedom, won little but an empty promise of free elections. Mid-conference, Churchill and Attlee went home for the results of their election.
It's a curious situation that a British general election took place after the defeat of Germany, but whilst the Allies were still fighting against Japan. What was even more curious, probably to both Stalin and Truman by that time, was that Churchill was defeated.
Even Clement Attlee himself thought the best result he could hope for would be a hung parliament, and in the end he got a huge majority.
The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy to face new world conditions.
It was inconceivable to the Soviets, of course, who pointed out they would have made certain that the outcome of the election would have been as they wished. I don't think that Truman and the Americans took quite this same approach, but everyone was stunned, I think, when Churchill was defeated.
The story is that somebody rang Churchill and said, well, it could be a blessing in disguise, and Churchill said, we're very well disguised.
His public response was this was very fair, the people had it very hard, it wasn't surprising they wanted to change. I think personally he obviously felt very, I think bitter is probably too strong a word, but he obviously felt very disappointed. He felt that he had run the race, and then he had been, as it were, rejected at the winning post.
Clement Attlee, Britain's new Prime Minister, returned to the Potsdam Conference alone to discover that Britain had little influence over the proceedings.
Attlee just slotted naturally into this in Churchill's place and did more or less the same things that Churchill would have done.
So it wasn't a question of Attlee abandoning Churchill's strong positions. He maintained them, but failed in all of them because Stalin and Truman wouldn't defer to the British point of view.
Although, of course, it was politely known as the Big Three, Attlee, Truman and Stalin. Actually, it was really the Big 2 1/4, wasn't it? And it was at Potsdam they started to realise it. Britain was not a great voice in the world any longer. The world was already beginning to be dominated by two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States.
Potsdam left many issues about the political future of Europe unresolved. But it was clear that this was the beginning of the end of any cooperation between the Allies. Within 3 months of the end of the war in Europe, a new war had started. The Cold War. A struggle between the two newly established superpowers with very different ideologies, but a shared ambition of world domination. "1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the Big Three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we see how in August, the ultimate weapon of mass destruction was used for the first time. In September, the European powers reclaimed their colonies, but still faced conflict with independence movements throughout Southeast Asia. At the dawn of the nuclear age, America's empire expands as Britain's falls into decline. By the start of August 1945, it was clear that Japan was facing defeat. But it continued to fight on, even though its German ally had been forced to accept unconditional surrender. The war in the Pacific had started for very different reasons from the war in Europe.
Germany goes to war because Hitler's got a blueprint for German expansion and to make a German empire to the east. The Japanese, on the other hand, have perhaps a different reason for going to war. The Japanese have no natural resources. And so when the Japanese attack, they're going there to seize key economic raw materials.
So at the end of the 1930s, Japan had needed to conquer its neighbors to ensure the growth of its industry. And to do this, it needed to expand its army. Understandably, other colonial powers hadn't liked this challenge to their established claims on these territories.
The Pacific was America's sphere of influence, and they were determined that they would have the predominant say in how it was going to be organized.
So in July 1941, the US and Britain had frozen Japanese assets. They'd issued an ultimatum. The Japanese had to cease their strategy of territorial aggression in the region or face ruin.
The Japanese are in dire economic straits because the Americans have, through sanctions, choked off all their supply of particularly aviation spirit and oil. So the Japanese have two courses in 1941. They can either surrender tamely to the Americans and do what the Americans want diplomatically, or they can fight. Well, anyone with a grain of sense would see the Japanese, with their culture of Bushido and samurai, were going to fight. The principal threat from the Americans is the US Pacific Fleet, which is up at Pearl Harbor, which must be neutralized.
On the 7th of December 1941, Japan made a surprise attack on the American naval base in Hawaii.
Without Pearl Harbor, it's very hard to imagine the United States entering the war with the kind of decisiveness that they eventually did. It had a huge psychological impact. The shock of Pearl Harbor, being attacked, as it were, of America, an unprovoked attack out of a clear blue sky, was stunning to Americans.
On the same day as Pearl Harbor, Japan's widespread main assault in the Far East commenced. They attacked Thailand, Shanghai, and the British colonies of Malaya, Hong Kong, and Singapore. The British, already stretched fighting Hitler, were forced to retreat. On the 25th of December 1941, Hong Kong surrendered as British officers handed over control to the Japanese. More than 130,000 British troops were captured. Singapore fell 2 months later.
Of course, the British were faced with an almost impossible position. Reinforcements weren't coming through. They hardly came through until the final Japanese push in 1944. So there was a very difficult dilemma for British officers and the British Army across that whole region.
Britain's whole prestige in this area rested on the idea that it was acting as a protecting power to local societies. And so when Britain failed to protect them, if you like, all the legitimacy of British rule evaporated overnight.
By mid-1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion seemed unstoppable. They had taken a huge swathe of territory. To the south, they occupied most of the Pacific and were even threatening to invade Australia. To the west, Japan had been fighting a major war in China ever since they had invaded Manchuria a decade previously.
So in a sense, Japan was actually invading part of China because Manchuria was not quite China. That's the way British Foreign Office thought that, because of the different tribes and so on. But from American point of view, there was definitely part of China. Of course, the United States was not happy with Japan's expansionism.
The American fleet was wounded by the attack at Pearl Harbor, but not destroyed, because crucially, their aircraft carriers were at sea. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway in the Pacific began to turn the tide in favor of the Americans. But thousands of American sailors had lost their lives. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Americans steadily recaptured Pacific islands from the Japanese. The British joined the campaign, but in reality were always the junior partner in the war in the Far East.
The relationship between Britain and the United States in the Pacific area was rather different than in Europe. The Americans saw the Pacific War as their war. They'd been attacked by Japan, they were going to get Japan. Now, Britain, of course, had their own interests in the Far East. They had a good part of the empire was there, not just India, but Malaysia, Burma particularly. And therefore, they felt they too had an interest in what was happening. But the Americans tended not to let them have much input into strategy.
Command in the Far East was split between General MacArthur for the Americans and Lord Mountbatten for the British, who was in charge of the Southeast Asia Command, or SEAC. The Americans, and in particular President Roosevelt, were suspicious of Britain's long-term motives.
What they were very uneasy about was the feeling that they were helping the British to reoccupy their colonial empire in Southeast Asia. And they even had a little acronym, a little interpretation of the acronym Southeast Asia Command, SEAC. They thought it meant Save England's Asian Colonies. And they were very unwilling to do that.
In this Asia-Pacific war, the Allies were not united in their view. You see, I mean, the Americans wanted to get rid of all these European colonies in Southeast Asia, for rightly or wrongly. There's no doubt that Roosevelt was hostile to the return of colonial regimes. Well, he was horse trading with Winston Churchill, who certainly did not want to give up India, and certainly the other colonies as well.
We have the Japanese to finish. We have to stand absolutely with our great American ally.
But on the question of empire, Churchill knew that the great American ally had very different views from his own. In January 1945, the Americans had triumphantly recaptured Manila, the capital of their own colony, the Philippines. But they didn't regard this as an imperial possession at all.
I think they always believed that American rule in the Philippines was of a different nature to British and French colonial rule. They considered themselves, almost by definition, as a democratic republic to be non-imperial, and therefore if they were engaged in imperialism, it couldn't be imperialism of the British and French kind, and that they were there genuinely for the benefit of the Philippines. There was a different kind of mindset, in other words, among the American public towards American rule in the Philippines. There was no tradition in the United States of going out and serving the empire.
Britain's vast empire in the East had been largely taken by the Japanese by mid-1942, except the biggest colony, India, which was to make a massive contribution to the British war effort.
India, until the Second World War, was relatively underdeveloped economically, but of course because it becomes a major centre of the British war effort, they have to begin to develop particularly local service industries on a very large scale. For instance, they begin to develop plants for canning meat. There's a huge increase in the production of bottled beer for the troops, and the Indian army swelled enormously in the Second World War. There was something like 2 million men under arms, so it contributed massively to British military world power.
Throughout 1944, the British and Indian armies fought fierce battles in Burma. The commander of the forces was General Sir William Slynn.
The war against Japan is going well. Our American allies in the Pacific have won great victories, and we have had our own successes in liberating the greater part of Burma. But the Japanese is a tough enemy, and much must be done before he will admit defeat.
Britain's primary objective in Burma was to reopen a supply route to their ally, China. The Chinese communists and nationalists had put aside their differences under leader Chiang Kai-shek to defeat the occupying Japanese. Finally, towards the end of 1944, after bitter fighting at the key Burmese battles of Impal and Komina, the Japanese began to pull back.
The Forgotten Army, 14th Army in Burma, under General Sir William Slim, is actually for the first time beginning to get the Japanese on the run. It pushes down and pushes the Japanese out of Burma. But it's not doing it just for that reason, because the prime aim of Mountbatten and Slim is to open up the Burma Road so that Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists, who are also fighting the Japanese, can be supplied. And the American Air Force puts a colossal effort into airlifting supplies in to supply the Chinese Nationalist Army. And this, if you like, double attack begins to roll the Japanese back in Burma.
By the start of 1945, the land route from India through to China had finally opened. And by March, the British 19th Indian Division had taken Mandalay. The Japanese were on the retreat. Local people were pleased to see them go, as one young schoolgirl recalls.
Although life wasn't so bad under the Japanese, we were happy to see them go. Our family could talk freely without having to constantly look over our shoulders. I remember the whole family getting rid of everything English we had in the house, just in case we got into trouble for it. My grandfather hid local currency in lampshades, and I had to destroy my collection of photographs of the English royal family.
The Americans were also rolling back the Japanese in the Pacific. By the 21st of June 1945, they had taken the island of Okinawa, but at great cost. The Americans realized that to take the Japanese mainland could cost the lives of up to 1 million American soldiers. They considered using their new secret weapon, the atom bomb. By May 1945, the war in the Pacific was entering its closing stages. On the 3rd of May, Britain's 14th Army entered Rangoon, the capital of Burma. They found a city left in ruins by the fleeing Japanese. Many of the civilians had been killed, and only 2/5 of the population remained in the city. The 14th Army pushed on into central Burma, fighting pockets of Japanese resistance all the way. Conditions in the Burmese jungle were appalling for both the Allies and their enemy. Retreating Japanese soldiers were abandoned by their officers and forced to march long distances. Many thousands died from hunger or disease. Some sought help from locals, as a Japanese soldier wrote in his diary.
I remember retreating through India to Burma during the monsoons, which took 6 months to go about 15 miles a day. Everyone got so sick with amoebic dysentery. We had no soles on our shoes. We just slept on the mountainside. The British Army were coming very slowly. The Burmese people were really nice to us. They were also Buddhist and felt sympathetic toward us because we were so sick. In total, we had lost about 75% of our men.
As the Japanese army fought desperately to avoid defeat, they forced the inhabitants of the occupied countries into their war effort as slave labor.
The Japanese, particularly in early 1945, as the war moves into its final stage, do in fact impress huge quantities of labor from across the whole region. And of course, one of the untold stories is the very, very large number of Burmese and Malay and even Indo-Chinese labor who actually die on the death row.
I mean, one of the most tragic legacies of the war, which was never really spoken about at the time, was the tens of thousands of women who were recruited by the Japanese in Korea, but right across Southeast Asia, for sexual slavery, to act as so-called comfort women for Japanese troops and officers.
Terrible things to happen to civilian populations in any war. And of course, on the Allied side, vast numbers of laborers were also drawn into not exactly forced labor, but pioneer work under terrible conditions on that Burma front, and again there was mass death. I mean, very large numbers of workers from the Assam tea estates, for instance, were impressed into service, and very large numbers of those died of cholera.
Prisoners of war were also used as slave labor and often treated cruelly. The Japanese thought that it was dishonorable to allow yourself to be taken by the enemy.
But I think overall the idea of becoming prisoner of war is somewhat regarded as very dishonorable. And that's part of the reason they treated prisoner of war very badly. How could you possibly believe someone remained prisoner of war, still hoping to survive? To them, it's a little bit incomprehensible. So in a sense, they haven't got any respect for prisoner of war.
Japanese military culture demanded that a soldier should die fighting rather than be captured. The commitment required of kamikaze, or suicide pilots, was signified in a religious ceremony. Mostly teenage boys, these suicide bombers had volunteered to make the ultimate sacrifice for the glory of their country and emperor.
Now, the Japanese kamikaze weapons came as a terrific shock to everybody when they came in, and in fact claw the American Navy back into serious casualties. One of the things that the Divine Wind, the kamikaze idea, brings up is a thing called the Baku bomb, which is basically rather like a V-1 flying bomb with a 1-ton warhead on the front. It's dropped from the belly of a bomber and then glides down in order to hit an aircraft carrier or a US naval target. The difference is, unlike the V-1, it's got a pilot, a very determined young man sitting there on his final mission. In fact, the Baku is not a particularly successful weapon. The kamikazes, on the other hand, on balance, although they may be a one-shot weapon, turn out to be enormously successful for a variety of reasons. One, they do hit their targets. Secondly, because there's no return flight, they've got double the range, a point that a lot of people often forget. And last but not least, because the Americans are so far from their fleet bases, any ship that's hit has to come out of the battle line and go a long way away to be repaired. Even a damaged ship's a victory.
In all, there were more than 5,000 kamikaze attacks against the Americans. During the last year of the war, they inflicted serious damage, and many ships were sunk. But America controlled the air over Japan, and their bombers could drop their deadly load anywhere on the mainland with no resistance.
I think Japan was the country who was thoroughly defeated. There was no clear defense measure against America's conventional bombing, strategic bombing. So clearly, by that time, Japan should have thought about surrendering or to acknowledge a defeat. But I think it's also, you must remember the ideas of surviving in war other than the victory was it's very difficult for Japan to conceive.
The terms on which the Allies would accept Japanese surrender were discussed by Stalin, Churchill, and President Truman when they met at Potsdam in July 1945.
The Allies, after Potsdam, issue an ultimatum saying that we must have unconditional surrender, and the Japanese pay no attention to this Potsdam Declaration on the grounds that they want a guarantee that the emperor's person will not be affected.
Unconditional surrender itself, as a concept, I don't think Japanese ministers could never understand its full implications. They expected emperor should be, being kept intact.
The Japanese thought that unconditional surrender would mean the end of Emperor Hirohito and the imperial system. They could not even begin to imagine this, because although the emperor had no political power, he was revered as the very embodiment of the nation. The end of the emperor meant the end of Japan.
The sticking point for Japan was the fate of Emperor Hirohito. From Truman's point of view, unconditional surrender was completely non-negotiable. Whenever he used the words unconditional surrender, chopping the air with his hands in that very distinctive Truman-esque gesture, whenever he used the words unconditional surrender, there'd be a storm of applause. So for as long as the Japanese held out and tried to prevaricate about the terms of surrender, the administration was determined to use all force it possibly had available.
The possibility of developing a nuclear weapon had been discussed before the war started. Einstein had even written to President Roosevelt, warning him about the potential danger of atomic power in the wrong hands. But in 1941, when America found itself at war, any reservations were pushed aside. A team of the country's best scientists were recruited to make the bomb. It was a secret and costly operation. Spread out over 40 sites, it was called the Manhattan Project. The biggest difficulty was creating pure, enriched uranium. Then, in 1942, at the Oak Ridge plant, they perfected a process that gave them a tiny amount of this vital ingredient. Throughout the war, Hitler had also been trying to develop the atom bomb, but Germany never managed to get enough pure uranium to make what Hitler dreamt would be his greatest weapon. Japan had the same plan and the same dream.
There was certainly evidence that Tojo, Prime Minister, he once said we would like to, have a successful atomic research, because if the, bomb becomes available, we'd like to obviously use it. And Japan would have used atomic weapons if they had successful bombs by that time.
But the Americans were way ahead. On July the 16th, 1945, the scientists on the Manhattan Project were ready to test one of the 3 devices that they had built. They called it Little Gadget. They didn't know what would happen, and some scientists were worried that the nuclear reaction might set off an unstoppable chain reaction which would destroy the world. As it turned out, the test was successful.
The logic of using the atomic bomb against Japan was inherent in the decision to put massive resources behind the Manhattan Project. The real decision, the agonizing that went on within the War Department and within the White House, was not really over whether to use the bomb in principle, but how to use it and when to use it.
On the 16th of July, in total secrecy, the Americans tested the atom bomb in New Mexico. On the 25th of July, they warned Japan of devastation from the final blows and called for unconditional surrender. The countdown to drop the bomb had begun.
People didn't know about it. Even fewer people, I think, had a concept of the sheer nature and the sheer magnitude of what it was. I suspect that a lot of people thought it was just a really big regular bomb. The fears about fallout and the nature of what it would do to people, I think, suspected by scientists, but not widely held. And probably even those who knew, who were in policymaking positions, thought, it doesn't matter. What matters is to bring the war to an end, defeating Japan, because the alternative was having their soldiers inch by inch on the beach, inch by inch through Japan, fighting a people that were determined not to give up a rock. So therefore, hundreds of thousands of Americans, it was perceived, would die if they didn't use the bomb. Would you rather kill hundreds of thousands of your own soldiers or hundreds of thousands of the enemy, was really what it came down to.
Some scientists thought the bomb should be exploded to demonstrate its power, not dropped on the Japanese people. But the Americans only had 2 bombs that were ready to use, and they were also worried that such a warning would unleash vengeance on prisoners of war in Japan.
Because they thought Japan might do that, sort of treating prisoner worse with the sort of demonstration. Demonstration might give a sort of Japanese to do some revenge. So they thought prisoner of war was a kind of vulnerable position.
The argument used for dropping the bomb on a Japanese city was that its mighty power would shock them into surrender. The scientists knew that the bomb's blinding light and towering mushroom cloud was unlike anything anyone had seen before.
Well, they hoped it might shock Japan into accepting unconditional surrender, because it would show that this massive power of scientific technology, and this is a new bomb which does yield sort of massive destructive power. So it is a sort of like to give the Japan as kind of this shock treatment.
In fact, many Japanese politicians were privately arguing for surrender. But the sticking point was the American demand that it be unconditional. The Japanese military thought this would mean the end of their nation. They argued that it was the duty of all Japanese people to die fighting. There was deadlock. Then, on the 28th of July, Tokyo radio broadcast a call to the people to fight on. Truman called in his advisors to decide what to do.
He was so fixated, as were everyone in the American administration, on the pressing need to end the war with Japan as fast as possible, that it's not really clear that he dwelt at great length on the moral or the world historical significance of what he was about to do.
Did Truman realize what it was? Did he agonize? Did it matter to him? From what one can tell from the evidence, he didn't agonize. He saw it as necessary. His advisors told him what it was. They told him it would probably bring the war to an end almost immediately, and they told him it would save the lives of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. And he didn't really hesitate.
On the 31st of July, Truman gave the order to drop the bomb on Japan as soon as the weather permitted. At 2 a.m. on the 6th of August, a B-29 Flying Fortress bomber, the Enola Gay, took off from a Pacific island, carrying a device nicknamed Little Boy. At 6 a.m., Colonel Paul Tibbets gave the order to his crew to arm the bomb, the world's first atomic device. It was a fine and sunny day in Hiroshima. 2 planes were seen flying high over the city. People thought they were just on a reconnaissance mission, so there was no air raid warning. The bomber dropped its deadly load at 8:16. Brighter than 1,000 suns is how the explosion was described by the Japanese. Some 66,000 people were killed outright, many of them vaporized by the intense heat and blast. All they left behind were their shadows. People suffocated as all available oxygen fed the massive fireball. The buildings were completely destroyed by a huge wind radiating out over 6 miles. By the end of 1945, a further 80,000 people had died of a mysterious new illness of the blood, radiation sickness. Over the next 5 years, a further 60,000 died of related illnesses.
There were some who called on Truman in public pleas to him not to use the bomb a second time. And there were many, even within the administration, of course, who hoped that one bomb drop would be sufficient to prompt a Japanese unconditional surrender.
On the 7th of August, the day after the bomb was dropped, President Truman announced to the world what had happened. That afternoon, an emergency meeting of the Japanese cabinet was called. While Hiroshima lay in ruins, military leaders argued that they should not admit the bomb had been dropped until a proper investigation had taken place. So a team of investigators were dispatched to the city. On the 8th, 2 days after the bomb was dropped, the investigation team finally arrived in Hiroshima. They were a day late because of a faulty plane. This delay would have deadly consequences. In the early hours of the 9th of August, the Red Army launched a devastating attack on Japanese forces in Manchuria. An urgent meeting of the War Council was called for 10:30 a.m. During this meeting, they received news that a second atomic bomb had been dropped, this time on Nagasaki.
But the second use of the bomb, of course, was to give a warning to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, it was feared, and indeed moves were beginning to be made, was moving into the Far East. The Soviet Union didn't declare war on Japan till virtually the end of the war. And the United States wanted to make it clear to the Soviet Union that they had this weapon and implicitly might be driven to use it.
The Soviets had spent 3 months moving vast numbers of men across Siberia and into China. Their target was to attack Japanese forces in the province of Manchuria.
There were still 1 million fanatical Japanese troops in Manchuria, the Kwantung Army. And the Soviet High Command, which by now was very experienced in conducting large-scale operations, got 3 fronts or army groups and set them up in a special Far Eastern command. And on the night of the 8th of August, they attacked simultaneously in a campaign that is really awesome in its scale and scope. Mongolian troops moving with tanks and crossing the Great Wall of China. So you've got something that would have been recognizable to Genghis Khan in the nuclear age.
The Red Army's ruthless and efficient military operation surprised the Japanese. This made it more difficult for Japan to carry on fighting.
Stalin had always been threatened by Japan all through the 1930s. He wanted to secure as much Japanese territory as possible under Soviet control as he possibly could. So he rushed contingents of the Red Army along the Trans-Siberian Railway, and he did grab northern territories of Japan, put them under Soviet military occupation, and they're still part of Russia today. They have never been given back to the Japanese.
By now, all the leading politicians in Japan wanted to surrender. But in some quarters, the generals still wanted to fight on.
They did not know fully how many bombs United States had at that time. And they somehow, I heard that they simply accepted sort of the some sort of rumor that United States may have about 100 odd atomic bombs. The next target may be Tokyo. So that's obviously frightened some of the Japanese leadership.
But still they could not agree on what to do.
Japanese sort of decision-making process was very much based on consensus. Eventually, because the consensus never seems to be established, and so therefore the emperor was asked to make a decision, which is very unusual, but he said, you know, we really have to accept the unconditional surrender.
Finally, on the 14th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito, on behalf of the Japanese people, surrendered. The following day, the emperor broadcast his message to the nation.
I remember the emperor's broadcast over the radio. We gathered together. I knew something terrible had happened. The emperor spoke very matter-of-fact, not encouraging at all, saying we would see a new future. There were rumors too going around that everyone had to commit suicide and that the emperor and ministers responsible would have to go to prison or be killed. I was very frightened.
World War II was finally over. But now, a new battle was about to begin. A political struggle for control of the post-war world. And because of the atom bomb, the stakes would be even higher than during the war. On the 14th of August, the Japanese government accepted the terms for peace set out at the Potsdam Conference. President Truman called a midnight press conference.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
The Japanese surrender prompted spontaneous celebrations throughout the United States of America. The following day, these scenes were repeated in Britain, VJ Day. But behind the scenes, the fine details still had to be hammered out. So General MacArthur, the American Supreme Commander, met Japanese officials in the Philippines. On the 30th of August, the American official occupation of Japan began as their troops landed for the first time on the Japanese mainland. The Western Allies now faced the huge task of reconstruction. Japan had been devastated by the war. An estimated 9 million people were made homeless. And throughout Southeast Asia, people were starving. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders signed surrender documents. The British hoped that they could now reoccupy their old colonies.
There was a strong feeling within the British Army that they wanted to be able to reconquer these territories by military or naval campaign in order to show who was top dog. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because MacArthur said after the Japanese surrender, no military activity until I, General MacArthur, have signed the overall surrender in Tokyo Bay.
This formal surrender to the Americans finally took place on board the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September, as American planes flew over the city. MacArthur had forced the British to wait for 3 weeks before they could reoccupy their former colonies. This had a dramatic impact on events in Asia. During the war, Japan had encouraged a feeling of independence in its occupied territories. At the end of the war, nationalist groups, by now armed, saw their chance to fight for complete independence, something the Japanese had already promised.
Burma, for instance, the Japanese did give formal independence to the country. There was a flag, there was somebody in charge who was Burmese, apparently. There were local officials who were Burmese. So people did, for the first time, see the possibilities of independence.
So as the British began to re-enter their former territories, they faced armed independence movements. In Malaya, for example, there was the local communist guerrilla army with whom the British had to negotiate. This was very different from the way things used to be.
Britain, and indeed France, traditionally worked through local elites. You didn't have millions of Frenchmen and millions of Britons actually out there running places. You worked through local elites, such as in India, and worked that way. Now the question is, if you have rising nationalist movements, Vietnam, for example, India for a long time, and so forth, do you suppress them or do you work with them?
Just extraordinary how Asian nationalism was galvanized by the war across the whole region. I mean, the British certainly went back into Southeast, or parts of Southeast Asia, but it was never the same again.
And I think some of the first wave of the Britons who arrived were actually appalled when they were met by young nationalists under arms who'd been trained and mobilized by the Japanese.
The attitude of the United Kingdom tended to be, you bought them off or you suppressed them. The United States said this was short-sighted, that you worked with these movements until you began to fear they might be communist, but you work with these movements because this is the future.
Many of these movements were, in fact, communist. And these guerrilla armies had been some of the most determined fighters against the occupying Japanese. The Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to expand its sphere of influence.
There were a large number of people in Moscow who volunteered as international volunteers for what they thought was going to be the forthcoming war for the liberation of India. Stalin, he was keen from an international communist point of view to see British power overthrown in its Asian colonies.
On the 21st of September, the leaders of Indian nationalism, Gandhi and Nehru, issued a demand. They wanted all of Southeast Asia to be free of imperialist domination. The reality on the ground was starvation for millions and widespread lawlessness. The Allies were determined to use any means to restore order. In Indonesia, a Dutch colony, the British were given the job of restoring Dutch colonial rule.
In the final hours of the war, the Indonesians had proclaimed independence under the charismatic figure Sukarno, and it fell to the British from October of 1945 to reoccupy Indonesia, restore order, and disarm what was at this point a nationalist army of the Republic of Indonesia.
Mountbatten, who was the British commander-in-chief for this region, Saxe, was told that he must take over the territory of Indonesia, and he moved in. He had inadequate troops to do anything in the way. I mean, Indonesia is a vast place with, 150 islands. So basically, he had no choice but to use the Japanese to retain security in the region.
In a controversial move, both the Americans and the British used Japanese troops to reimpose order and suppress the nationalist armies in many of the colonies.
What happened was that the Japanese gave over command of their troops, most of which were still armed, to the Allied victors. So across the region, the British and the Americans were very often using armed Japanese troops to restore order. And this was another reason for extreme hostility on the part of Asian people. And indeed, many British soldiers were extremely dubious about the use of their former enemies so quickly against people who might have been their former friends.
One of these dubious British soldiers was a 24-year-old infantryman seeing Japanese troops for the first time.
Our unit was first ashore. Within yards, we bumped into our first Japanese troops. They were all still fully armed. From then on, the strangest surrender in military history took place. The Japanese army still kept all their arms until the formal surrender. We pushed on for a mile. The first 4 weeks in Malaya were surrealistic. When we took over the small town of Alor Star, we put the Union Jack on the flagpole of the town hall. But the company commander ordered us to take it down.
The flag came down because the British officer needed the loyalty of the Japanese troops to enforce law and order. But the Japanese had no choice but to cooperate with their conquerors, whose bombs had flattened 2 of their largest cities. A serving officer in Japan at the time was Professor Ian Nish.
I naturally wanted to go to Hiroshima and see for myself from where my unit was. And I mean, for various reasons, one didn't have cars or jeeps or anything. One had to go by train. And so I went on my own and I just wandered about the deserted streets. It was a wasteland.
The Second World War had ended, but at an enormous cost in human life. And its legacy would be felt for decades to come. Victory had ushered in the nuclear age, a period of great fear and suspicion, where the former Allies now threatened global destruction. "1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the Big Three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we see how, as 1945 drew to an end, the world was to change shape forever. Millions of people were forced to move home and country as borders were redrawn and new occupying governments installed. The wartime trials at Nuremberg in November aimed to mete out justice to the Nazi leadership. By the end of the year, America and the Soviet Union were on the brink of a new Cold War. The forces which were to shape international politics for the next 50 years took root in 1945. By the autumn of 1945, the Second World War was over. Germany and Japan had been defeated, but at an unimaginable cost. Across the world, 55 million people had been killed. The use of the atom bomb against the Japanese people had changed the very nature of warfare itself. Defeated countries were under the military and political control of the victors, with no idea when this would end. Germany was divided into zones controlled by America, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. By August, Japan was occupied by the Americans alone. Countries across the world had been devastated by the war, and although the victors were concerned about global security, reconstructing their economies at home was a major priority. Only America had escaped the war unscathed.
The mainland United States had not been invaded, had not been attacked, nothing had happened. So its industrial position was unimaginable. In a sense, it was way up there, and everyone else was down here.
Between 1940 and 1944, American industry had grown by 50%. America was now the richest country on earth, and its citizens had the highest standard of living by far. The country truly was the economic powerhouse of the world.
The United States had had a good war. This was a war that had returned prosperity to the American people, that had restored the American people's faith in capitalism and abundance, in their sense that the American dream was still alive, that the prospects for the future never looked brighter. What had happened during the war was that people had been earning higher wages than they'd ever had before. Employment was full. Even people serving the army were earning wages of a scale that they couldn't have imagined before the war. And what they'd done with all that money was to save it. And so there was a tremendous consumer spending boom in the end of 1945 and into 1946. And Americans were going out and buying cars and buying radios and buying new homes. There was also great geographical mobility within the United States during the war, a migration on an unprecedented scale of African Americans from the South into the great industrial cities of the North, where the jobs were during the war. And that, of course, was to have a profound impact on American society after the war.
Black Americans in the South still lived in a society segregated by race, and many returning black soldiers found they had fought fascism and racism abroad, only to face it themselves when they got home.
There was no big fanfare on coming home, though it was good to see my family. Prejudice was just the same as before the war, but instead of anger, I focused on finishing my education. I went to post-grad school and got my master's, but when it came time for applying to the major corporations, I was in for a shock. Though I got interviews, it was my white counterparts that were offered the jobs, some of whom I had assisted. Despite being better qualified than most, and my contribution to the nation as a combatant soldier, the options for me as an African American were not wide enough.
There's no doubt that the experience of African Americans during the Second World War sowed the seeds for the future civil rights movement.
A movement which was paralleled in the British Empire, as demands for independence in India and elsewhere grew to a clamour. But it was, however, an empire which Britain could ill afford. As the only country which had fought all through the war, Britain was victorious, but bankrupt. For the British people, life in peacetime was to be a bitter continuation of wartime deprivations.
In a perverse way, the British predicament at the end of the Second World War was the worst, because while the Germans had a profound sense, not of guilt, but of defeat, they knew they'd lost, the British thought they'd won. Everyone had imagined there would be an exultation about victory, but in the end, when they actually stood among the rubble of the Blitz and the rockets in England and the poverty of a nation that had bankrupted itself, that somehow it all seemed terribly disappointing. And somehow the two latecomers to the Second World War, the Russians and the Americans, both of which had not joined in as a matter of principle, but only because they were attacked, had come out as top dogs.
Millions of British troops were demobbed by the end of 1945. They came home with high expectations, which all too often were severely dashed.
For a soldier coming back to his family, it was obviously a joyful reunion up to a point. He was often a stranger to his children. His wife had to find ways of coping and being independent during the war, which had, in a sense, excluded a husband. A man had been living in an entirely male environment where his life was very structured for him. He suddenly had to come back, readjust to his home life, find a job, demobilisation in an austere, decaying, devastated country. I think it was an extraordinarily difficult time.
For women too, the adjustment was difficult. For many, the freedom of their wartime years was over.
The divorce rate rose hugely after the Second World War. It had been around 10,000 in 1938, and it rose to over 25,000 in 1945. 70% of that was for adultery. And what was a change was, of course, for the first time, more women were suing for divorce than men.
The main material demand was for more housing, as millions of homes had been destroyed by bombing. Food and clothing were also in short supply, and rationing of some basic goods continued right up until 1954.
After the war, there was a terrible housing shortage. I lived in 2 rooms in an aunt's house. We had a bedroom and a room with a sink and a stove, and we had use of the bathroom. My friend lived in even smaller rooms. She was terribly excited that she could buy a new saucepan. There was such a shortage of everything. Another aunt was eventually housed in a brand new prefab which looked just like a cream and green trimmed doll's house. Rationing went on for a long time after the war. You couldn't buy furniture. You had to buy utility furniture, which was very cheap wood put together to make chests of drawers and tables, and you even had to have coupons for that.
In July, the hope of a better, fairer world had swept a Labour government to power under the leadership of Clement Attlee.
The harsh reality of Britain at the end of the war was that although there were enormous expectations of the Attlee government, there were expectations of a better society, expectations of an end to poverty, but Attlee was dealing with a near-bankrupt nation, dreadfully in hock to the Americans. The economic problems of creating a new society were absolutely enormous.
Undaunted, on the 12th of October, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, made his first budget speech. This outlined Labour's vision for the future and paved the way for the nationalisation of industry and the creation of a welfare state and national health service.
This is the programme on which we were elected. This is the programme we intend to carry out. And my job as Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer is to find the money to do all these things properly.
An awful lot of people were saying to the Attlee government, well, yes, it's all very nice to have a fairer society and social security and decent education and health, but not now because we're bankrupt. And Attlee, of course, knew that now was the political opportunity. Now was the only time. If it wasn't going to be now, it was going to be never.
The Soviet people had paid a very high price for winning the war. 1 in every 10 had died, and thousands of towns and cities were leveled. Whole rural districts were destroyed, and farming had practically ceased.
In the Soviet Union, which had taken a disproportionate share of casualties, some 27 million killed overall, large numbers of men were dead, so a huge burden focused on women If you look at the statistics, the population after the Second World War, the imbalance between men and women is quite extraordinary. The Soviet Union, in fact, had no resources to throw into reconstruction because everything in Western USSR had been completely destroyed, and the effort they'd put into winning the war had been inordinate.
Looting and black marketeering were rife, and social order had virtually collapsed.
Stalin quickly opted to restore the old system of controls in the USSR. He was going to reconstruct the country, not by making concessions to popular opinion. He knew that if he did this, it would be seen as a permanent weakening of the old system. And he saw his own power and the party's power as essential for the maintenance of the USSR as a global power.
The struggle for global power between Stalin and the other world leaders was to have a profound impact on the millions of people whose lives had already been changed forever by the war. The victors wanted peace, but on their own terms. The price that the people of Europe were to pay was ethnic cleansing on a vast scale. The autumn of 1945 saw the dawn of a new post-war era. America had the most powerful economy in the world. The Soviet Union was a global power, but like Britain, it had been financially crippled by the war. The process of reconstruction was to be long and painful. After 6 years of war, the victorious Allies were keen to create the foundations of a stable and peaceful world. Their big fear was that a war would be provoked by a series of ethnic conflicts, particularly in those European countries where German people were living.
There were many millions of ethnic Germans, German-speaking people, who lived right across Eastern Europe and who'd done so, in many cases, for decades, if not centuries. And the existence of this kind of patchwork quilt of German minorities right across Eastern Europe, up along the Baltic, into Russia, down the Volga, and so on, was something which the Western Allies and the Soviet Union considered had been a major impulse towards the Second World War and a major cause of atrocities during the war. It's important to remember that the Nazi plan for Eastern and East Central Europe had been one of total ethnic reordering, in which Jews who lived there were to be exterminated. Up to 30 million Slavic inhabitants were to be allowed in the longer term to die of starvation or to be worked to death. And ethnic Germans who lived there or who lived in Germany itself were to be moved in, moved around, and put in charge of large farms which would be worked by slaves from the local population. And without that kind of background, it's very difficult to understand the hatred and bitterness which the local Czechs, Slovaks, Poles and others felt towards ethnic Germans.
The policy of ethnic transfer, what we now call ethnic cleansing, was well established before the war ended. As Stalin's Red Army moved west, ethnic minorities were removed to eliminate conflict or dissent. In late July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, this policy got the official stamp of approval. Churchill, Stalin and Truman backed the mass deportation of ethnic Germans from their homes across Europe, including those living in Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary.
Potsdam delineated a new map. It redrew the boundaries for many of the countries of Eastern Europe. The big change occurred with the moving of Poland westwards. The country was moved across so that it gobbled up a piece of Germany, but it released a piece of its own territory to the USSR. So various territorial redrawings took place. And while these were being done, ethnic cleansing also took place.
Before the war, a third of Poland was made up of Ukrainians, Jews, and other different nationalities. By 1948, 95% of its inhabitants were Polish Catholics. While the Soviet Union looked after the transfer of populations in the Ukraine and Poland, Britain and America organized the transfer of ethnic minorities in the West.
One saw after the war something on the order of 12 million people traveling from one part of Europe, often their homes for generations, to another part because they happened to share ethnicity. Perhaps not history, perhaps not tradition, perhaps not for generations had they been there. Nevertheless, they were forced to go.
My family lived in Karlsbad in the Sudetenland. One day, all German women and children were told to pack a few things. My mother, siblings, and I were taken to a camp. Then we were ferried in dark cattle trucks to West Germany. There we were sent to another camp until we ended up in a tiny village in the area of Thüringen. From here I walked every day for an hour through the snow to work in a toy workshop. I had to earn money for us to eat. My employer felt sorry for me. He told me to look for work in a local family instead. So I found a job helping a woman in the house. She said, let's give it a try for a month. On the 28th day, I was so frightened that I would have to leave the next day. I began to weep. But they told me I could stay, and I lived there for the next 2 years.
It was a dreadful period for the Germans in particular, who were fleeing with just what they could take into their hands, into the new Germany, where they weren't welcomed. For the Poles who were dumped in Silesia, they could move into German houses. But there was a lot of wreckage in the new Poland, and the task of economic reconstruction was only just beginning. So for very, very large numbers of people, the war had been bad enough, but the immediate post-war period was almost as bad.
Millions of people were forcibly removed from their homes, 12 million of whom were Germans. And the borders of Europe were literally redrawn beneath their feet. It became a continent primarily of ethnically separate countries. The exception was Yugoslavia. Its wartime nationalist resistance had grown into a massive political force. By the end of the war, it had captured enough states to create the new country of Yugoslavia under the leadership and control of General Tito.
Josip Broz Tito, the strongman of the partisan movement during the Second World War, the resistance movement that fought the German occupiers, actually had to construct a Yugoslavia which brought together a variety of different nationalities to create a bigger territorial entity, the state of Yugoslavia, but it was based on multi-ethnicity. It was based on the idea that you can pull together a variety of different ethnic groups, and slowly these people will believe in a Yugoslav nation and start calling themselves Yugoslavs, which made it completely different from the other states in the region.
Both Stalin and the West were irritated by Yugoslavia, fearing that it threatened stability in Europe. The West feared a communist state in the region. Stalin hated a communist state which he did not control. Until his death in 1980, Tito managed to withstand both external and internal pressure on the boundaries of Yugoslavia. But in the 1990s, his dream of a multi-ethnic society collapsed into bloody civil war. Stability in Europe was not the only ambition of the Allies. They wanted global stability as well, defined spheres of influence and the resolution of disputes through dialogue and negotiation, not through a third world war. Even before victory was secured, Churchill and Roosevelt had started to talk about the rules and institutions which would be needed to maintain peace and security when the war was over.
The project for reshaping the international order began in August 1941 when Churchill and Roosevelt met in Newfoundland and concocted a document called the Atlantic Charter. It's a very short document. And it basically proposed a new world order, a world order based on rules, and premised on three basic foundations. Firstly, that states would be subject to limits on the use of force. War would be outlawed. Secondly, states would respect the dignity of the human individual, and that was how international human rights law was born. And thirdly, states would subject themselves to a system of economic liberalization, free trade, and all the related market-type mechanisms which we're now rather familiar with. And it more or less put in place the system which we still have today.
The Second World War was obviously a turning point in America's not only views of the world, but of her place in the world. The U.S. did not want to be involved in yet another world war, and to prevent that, they had to try to, in a sense, not only be part of the world, but to try to reconstruct the world in a way that this would obviate the need for war. And the main forum for this was going to be the United Nations.
The structure of the United Nations was hammered out by the Allies during the war years. Every nation was to be represented, and its mission was to maintain peace, with the use of force if necessary. But the use of force was to be decided not on a majority vote, but by the much smaller Security Council.
There had been a lot of negotiation. The question, was there going to be a veto in the Security Council? Who was going to be members? How did you join the United Nations? What were going to be the powers of the General Assembly as opposed to the Security Council? And eventually what happens is that negotiations, give and take, came up with an organization each of the great powers could live with.
The United Nations Charter was ratified on the 24th of October 1945 by 51 countries. But the ultimate power rested with the permanent members of the Security Council: the Soviet Union, America, Britain, France, and China. Even today, these 5 remain the only members of the United Nations top table.
You members of this conference are to be the architects of a better world. In your hands rests our future.
The Allies now moved on to holding the Nazis to account, with the creation of the world's first international war crimes tribunal. By November 1945, a World Peacekeeping Council, the United Nations, had been created. Europe was being reshaped into single ethnic states. But the future of Germany in the New World Order had still to be agreed. None of the Allies wanted a resurgent, aggressive Germany in the heart of Europe.
Germans were still living in a very miserably poor situation where there was still a lot of bomb damage to be cleared up, although the effort to clear up bomb damage under the supervision of the Allies started almost straight away and was carried out particularly by women, so-called rubble women who cleared away the rubble. They were living in conditions where currency was losing its value and where the black market, which had already begun under the Nazis in the later years of the war, reached epidemic proportions.
Germany was a major problem for governments because there was virtually nothing left, and what they didn't want to do was to recreate what they had seen before. The job was to rebuild Germany, but to punish the Nazis.
To denazify Germany, the Allies had to identify those who had been active in the Nazi regime and those who were in effect fellow travelers.
Thousands and thousands of Germans were forced to fill out very lengthy and elaborate forms detailing what they'd done and what they belonged to in the Third Reich, and were subjected to interviews. It's an unprecedented operation on an enormous scale, trying to establish the exact degree of complicity of an entire population in the crimes of its former regime. And according to the way you were actually placed on this list of hardline Nazi all the way down through fellow traveller down to not being involved, you were then given or denied opportunities to have a job, earn a living, enter the professions, take up your previous profession. And of course, this very quickly became the object of a great deal of political manoeuvring, as people who had been very heavily implicated in the regime tried to get testimonies to convince the denazification tribunals that they'd in fact only been fellow travellers, or fellow travellers that they'd really not been involved at all. There's a lot of evidence that Nazism had penetrated more deeply into the mentality of younger Germans than it had amongst older ones. The Allies mounted a massive re-education program with new school textbooks, with attempts to find teachers in schools who would be committed to democratic values, with radio programs, films.
After the war, Russian soldiers moved into our town. At the cinema, we were shown films of the release of prisoners from concentration camps. My parents, I, and everyone I know were absolutely horrified. Anyone closely connected with the Nazi Party was removed from their jobs. I don't know if my father was a member of the Nazi Party, but a lot of people were. They had to be. The husband of my mother's best friend was a teacher. He lost his job and was cutting wood to make money. People did what they could to survive. Lots of people left, and I thought we had to go as well. But father said no, we should stay. He was a children's doctor and was needed to work in the hospital. He also had to look after the Russian soldiers and their wives, so he and we were pretty much left alone.
The leading participants in the Nazi regime faced a different fate.
Initially, Churchill, and Stalin too, had thought simply of shooting Hitler and the leading Nazis insofar as they survived the war out of hand. But they were persuaded eventually that it would make a lot more sense and perhaps have a more educative effect and, of course, emphasize the rule of law, which had suffered so badly in Nazi Germany, if they put them on trial before an international military tribunal.
So what was envisaged was to create an international tribunal which would exercise jurisdiction over individuals for illegal war, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity. There was also a broader project of denazifying Germany, showing the entire population that what had happened was not acceptable, showing that when individuals breached established standards of human behavior, they would be punished.
Nuremberg was chosen as the site of the trials because it had been the place where the Nazis had held their annual party rally right through the Third Reich, and so to come to have a symbolic importance as the national centre of National Socialism.
Before 1945, there were no rules of international law which generally prohibited violations of fundamental human rights, or which stopped one state from using military force against another state, or which dealt with global trade or foreign investment or finance. The general position was that under international law, a state was free to do whatever international law didn't expressly prohibit it from doing. So if there were no clear rules on something, the state was free to act. There were no rules on genocide, there were no rules on extermination of large parts of your population, and states were free in international law to do that. They had to draft rules from new, and that has always dogged the Nuremberg system, because it meant that the rules which were applied to events occurring after 1939 didn't exist when the events actually occurred. And that's why Nuremberg has always been referred to as victor's justice. They drafted the rules, they adopted the rules after the terrible events had happened.
Despite all the difficulties and uncertainty about how to bring the Nazis to account, the trials began on November the 20th, 1945.
However unsatisfactorily and imperfect the Nuremberg trials were. They were a real attempt to impose a code of justice upon a regime that had brought unspeakable misery upon the world.
24 leading Nazis were tried at the first Nuremberg tribunal. 11 were sentenced to death, and the rest imprisoned.
The trials are very widely publicised. They were filmed, they were shown in newsreels. They were seen very much as a way of educating the German people in the criminal nature of the regime that they'd been living under since 1933. But this only had a limited effect, I think. You can't change a people overnight. And although these efforts were very widespread and very seriously undertaken, there was a growing belief amongst Germans that they too had been victims of the war. And many Germans saw the war crimes trials as something rather vindictive.
Many other smaller trials of Nazi collaborators were also held.
There was a trial of doctors who'd been involved in medical experimentation in the camps. There was a trial of lawyers who'd been involved in the perversion of justice and the meting out of death sentences for trivial offences and many other things. There was a trial of big industrialists. There was a trial of leading SS officers implicated in the mass shootings and extermination of Jews.
Over 1,700 individuals were tried between 1946 and 1949. With hundreds of Nazis imprisoned or executed for war crimes. But many other Nazis escaped justice.
We may say 60 years on how terrible it was that a lot of evil men escaped to Spain or to South America and so on. That a lot of Western soldiers, they'd had enough. They didn't want retribution. They just wanted peace. Yes, virtually all the top Nazis were caught. Yes, as many of the architects of the concentration camps who could be found were brought to justice. And yes, summary justice was extracted by the Russians in particular. But otherwise, a lot of very bad men slipped away into the cracks of Europe and were never seen again in the West.
In Japan, justice was also pursued by the Allies. Trials began in Tokyo in May 1946 under American supervision. Here, hundreds of Japanese officers were tried for war crimes and crimes against Allied prisoners of war. But many more were to escape justice as the Cold War began to overshadow American international politics. The roots of this Cold War, which would last nearly half a century, could already be seen in the last months of 1945. By December 1945, the shape of the rest of the 20th century was already sketched out. Britain was no longer a world player. America was an economic powerhouse, ready to convert the world to capitalism. And the Soviet Union, while economically weak, was ideologically strong and determined to defend communism.
From being a pariah state, or a sort of rogue state in the 1920s and 30s, to the verge of extinction in 1942, it had sprung back to a position where it was the only power that could effectively oppose and balance the United States on the world stage.
Stalin, at the end of the war, knew that the Americans intended to be the dominant world power. They were setting up military bases, linking up the whole of the world. They were penetrating the political orders in the most powerful countries all around the world. They were using their economic might as a means of increasing their political and military power.
By the end of 1945, the Soviet Union was well on the way to being one of the two superpowers. It did not have working nuclear weapons, but it was working on them and would have them within 4 years.
In August 1949, the Soviet Union ran their first successful atomic test. But the really important weapon for the Americans in their battle with the Soviet Union was their economy. From the Depression of the 30s, America had become the richest country in the world.
At the end of 1945, half of the manufacturing capacity of the world was in the United States. The Americans had an almost complete monopoly over the developing new technologies of electronics and aerospace. The United States was, far from being bankrupt, was a massive creditor nation. It was at the summit of its power.
Certainly the Soviet Union expected the United States to go into a profound depression after the end of the war because it would have no one to sell its surplus production to. And therefore it was to the benefit of the United States that it tried to reconstruct not only countries, but international financial and economic systems to rebuild the world so that its farmers, its producers, its industrialists have someone to sell their goods to.
The Americans wanted new markets, and they also believed that international trade would make war less likely.
Somehow things had to be organized that would not only make war more impossible, but more unlikely, because people weren't going to be so concerned with taking people's territories or people's trade and so forth.
During the war, the American and British governments had been planning for a post-war world. They thought free trade and international economic cooperation would prevent booms and slumps and help countries in financial difficulties.
The idea is, when you bind economies and make them economically interdependent, it's much more difficult for conflict, for war to break out. That's the logic of free trade. The essential elements of globalization in its modern sense, namely that one state, one community, has an interest in what another community does or doesn't do, was established by the vision of Churchill and Roosevelt.
However, by the end of the war, Britain and America were no longer equal partners, and much of this cooperative sentiment disappeared. One of the first victims was Britain itself. With her gold reserves wiped out, Britain had survived the war by relying on American aid and military and industrial equipment, which was to be paid for later. This scheme was known as Lend-Lease.
Fairly soon after the Attlee government came in, the United States suddenly withdrew Lend-Lease. This was a lifeline to Britain, and it meant imminent bankruptcy. So the only thing that was left for Britain to do was to seek a vast American loan. And there were long and detailed and bitter negotiations.
It was pretty clear to the Americans that Britain was in dire economic shape. The Americans saw the British need for finance as a way of getting the British to accept various policies the United States wanted them to accept, various policies, economic policies, open up the empire to American trade, for example. The British saw this as opening up the empire for American business to take it over commercially. The Americans saw it as freedom for their businessmen. That's one good example of the types of changes the United States wanted to enforce in Britain as a price of the financial aid that Britain so desperately needed.
The vote by the American Congress of the loan to Britain is good news.
The agreement that was finally reached was for a loan, a rather smaller loan than Britain had hoped to get, but a loan nonetheless, enough to stave off immediate bankruptcy.
Britain borrowed £3.75 billion, but on very harsh terms, and it had to be repaid with interest over the next 50 years.
The terms, in effect, meant that there was bound to be a financial crisis in Britain within 2 or 3 years, and the financial crisis, in fact, duly arrived in 1947.
And it forced the Americans to see what they hadn't really admitted before, just how weak Britain was.
Now, of course, the long-term result means both political and economic dependence on the United States, and has ever since. There isn't a single prime minister since Attlee, I suspect, who didn't see America and the American relationship as the only one that really fundamentally mattered. But the reason that that is the case is partly political dependence, but it is partly because we still owe vast sums of money dating back initially to that enormous loan negotiated between Attlee and Truman.
Today, Britain still owes America over £200 million.
Of any other country.
But in 1945, Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, was not deterred by the attitude of the Americans. He refused to be deflected from his plans for social reform.
All sorts of things that we now take for granted. The idea that if you're ill, you can go to the doctor. You don't have to count your bank balance and say, oh, I can't afford the doctor. The idea that everybody has a right to secondary education, that dates from the Attlee government. The idea that if you're out of work, you don't starve. There is a basic subsistence supplement. All of that was creation by the Attlee government. None of it existed before. An awful lot of it does not exist still in vast chunks of the world, including the United States of America.
But at the time, many thought America would follow Britain.
What was happening in Britain seemed to some Americans to be almost self-evidently the way of the future. And they assumed that sooner or later, progressives in America assumed that sooner or later the United States would follow the British example down the path towards a national system of health insurance, federal support for housing and education. The reason why eventually it didn't get anywhere was because the conservative alliance of Republicans and conservative Democrats were now bolstered by being able to contrast an American tradition of self-help and individualism and limited government against what was increasingly perceived as the looming Soviet threat.
As American attitudes hardened, their government seized effective control of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both established during the dying days of 1945. The cooperation and support of the war years and the hopes of this continuing in peace was soon forgotten, and Europe was to face years of extreme hardship. Not until after 1945 did America offer substantial support for reconstruction with the introduction of the Marshall Plan.
The United States, through the Marshall Plan, forced these countries, encouraged these countries, facilitated these countries to get rid of these tariff barriers and make it one huge market. This would enable Europe to reconstruct, to become a viable continent again, against the Soviet Union, amongst other things, and also a huge market for all the surplus American grain and tinned meat products and cars and steel, a market for these goods to be sold. So it was a win-win situation for the United States, and indeed for Europe as well.
West Germany, with the help of Marshall Aid, also began to recover, and by the late 1950s, began to boom.
What really made the difference in the end to the way the Germans thought about democracy was the experience of the so-called economic miracle in the 1950s. The economy, thanks to Marshall Aid from the Americans and thanks to many other factors, had really taken off. And it finally became clear to Germans that democracy, in West Germany at least, could deliver prosperity in a way that the Weimar Republic in the years before Nazism had signally failed to do.
In Japan also, America saw the importance of its occupation to ensure both the reconstruction of the country from the devastation of war and the creation of an ally against what they saw as a growing communist threat from China. America ended its occupation of Japan in 1952, by which time Japan had a healthy economy and political democracy. By the end of 1945, the world was dividing into two ideological blocs. The Soviet Union was imposing communism on the countries it had liberated from Germany at the end of the war, while America was extending its political influence in the West. These opposing views would dominate global politics for nearly 50 years.
The end of 1945, we have a world transformed. You have a United States of unimaginable power, strength, wealth, and influence. You have a United Kingdom that is aware of its weakness, but also aware even more of how much it has to cleave together with the United States, which is one major reason why they, in a sense, as far as they can, go along with what the United States wants. But you've also got a Soviet Union that, in a sense, has reverted to its pre-war position of being seen as an enemy. So you have a situation where the three allies, for various reasons, have to work together, but maintain a wary distrust. And this made for a post-war world of tension and some danger, and certainly a lot of unexpected outcomes.
As 1945 came to an end, millions hoped that they and their children and grandchildren would never see the like of the last 6 years ever again. There have been wars, terror, and genocide since, but many millions have also experienced relative peace and prosperity.